The committee will come to order. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. We meet today to examine President Trump's decision to withdraw from northern Syria, clearing the way for Turkey to attack America's Syrian Kurdish partners. It's a decision I view as disastrous. To our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee, welcome to members of the public and the press, and thank you to our friends from C-SPAN who are broadcasting this important proceeding. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. This committee has a long tradition of bipartisanship. Mr. McCall and I work on that every day. I think we're the most bipartisan committee in Congress. The main reason is that members on both sides tend to share a vision of American foreign policy that's firmly rooted in and guided by our values, particularly support for human rights and human dignity. We know that American leadership can and should be a force for good in the world. We know that on the world stage, our country thrives on the power of partnerships and alliances. But as Congress, we're limited in what we can do to actually make foreign policy. We can advance legislation and send strong messages and conduct oversight that we hope will push policy in the right direction. But at the end of the day, the tools to make policy largely reside with the President. And what we've seen these past 2 weeks has been just devastating as far as I'm concerned. It was around 2 weeks ago today that President Trump had a phone call with Turkey's President Erdogan, who more closely resembles an autocrat than the president of a NATO ally. Despite the administration's spin, we all know that Trump gave Erdogan the green light to charge into northern Syria. What followed was completely predictable for anyone who's paid attention to the Middle East: a brutal campaign of violence against the Syrian Kurds, our partners who courageously stood alongside us in the fight against ISIS. All the worst-case scenarios we imagined played out at stunning speed. To start, the betrayal of our Kurdish partners. We handed them over to be slaughtered and ethnically cleansed from a region where they've lived for generations, with no warning and for no good reason. How could the United States do something so senseless, so disgraceful, so contrary to our values? What message does it send to our other partners and allies, to our adversaries, to our brave men and women in uniform who served alongside the Kurds? We also have to address the humanitarian crisis this has created. Already tens of thousands have been displaced, families, women, and children. There are stories of gruesome killings, torture, and abuse, all set into motion by the President's horrific decision. And this decision was a body blow to our national security. President Trump has handed a gift to America's enemies, ISIS, Russia, and Iran. Coalition efforts to fight ISIS began under the Obama administration, and it had made a lot of progress. We had reclaimed territory and put thousands of ISIS fighters in prisons. Who ran those prisons? Our Kurdish partners. Now the Kurds are fighting tooth and nail to survive Turkey's assault. And so the fate of those thousands of the ISIS fighters is now dangerously up in the air, and more than 100 have already escaped. It's safe to say ISIS is celebrating President Trump's foreign policy right now. He's handed them their biggest victory in over 4 years, but they're not the only ones rejoicing. Assad regime forces in Syria, backed by Iran and Russia, are now filling the vacuum left by America's withdrawal. To see Russian-backed forces triumphantly moving in, taking over our American bases, it's just disgraceful. It hurts. It's embarrassing. And Putin knows it. And for all these disastrous effects of Trump's initial decision, President's actions to try to paper over this mistake has only done more damage. Last Thursday, the administration announced that they had negotiated a quote-unquote ceasefire with Turkey. This is a pattern of President Trump's presidency. He likes to play the part of the fireman when really he's the arsonist who started the fire in the first place. I know Mike Pence, Vice President, worked hard on this, but it was impossible to put out the fire. The reality of this 5-day so-called pause is that Turkey got everything it wanted, and that arrangement ended yesterday with no real plan from the administration for what comes next. This is the worst example I've seen of what I call this administration's fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants foreign policy. 1 minute, the president's shouting from the rooftops that he's fine with what Turkey is doing. The next, he says he'll destroy Turkey if they continue. One day, he's bringing our soldiers home. The next, he's moving them to continue their mission, but just over the Syrian border in Iraq. And the day after that, he's suddenly saying that some will actually stay in Syria after all, not to protect the Kurdish fighters, which we should do, the Kurdish fighters who stood shoulder to shoulder with our personnel, but to protect the oil fields there. It's all a mess. There's only one thing that's certain here: the president yet again has created a disaster. This is a troubling moment in our history, a stunning defeat for the United States, offered up willingly by a president whom I believe is doing serious damage to American leadership around the world. Today we need to hear how the administration plans to grapple with the consequences. What sort of signal do our friends take from this whipsawed foreign policy? And our adversaries, what kind of message does it send to the world when the president cannot be trusted to act in the interests of the United States? How can America be trusted to keep its word when we betray one of our close partners? And how do we handle the threats of ISIS, Iran, and Russia now that they've been handed a remarkable victory by the President of the United States? I look forward to hearing our witnesses address these issues, but first let me recognize our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for any remarks he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The American-led campaign to destroy the so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria was a great military success in our ongoing war on terror. This achievement wouldn't have been possible without the courage and sacrifice of our partners on the ground, including the Syrian Kurds, Arabs, and others, thousands of whom died on the battlefield in our shared quest to defeat ISIS. Our military partnership with the Syrian Democratic Forces is vital to our ongoing counter-ISIS operations to fight ISIS's insurgency. And that is why I've been so concerned about the possibility of withdrawing all U.S. troops from Syria. I firmly believe we need a residual force in Syria to best continue counterterrorism operations so that we can protect the homeland. I'm worried that a full withdrawal will create space for ISIS to regroup, grow, and gain more strength. We learned from President Obama's reckless retreat from Iraq that power vacuums are exploited by America's worst enemies. We do not want to repeat the same mistake. We must learn from history. I believe our Syrian partners deserve better. What kind of signal does it send to the international community that the United States will turn our back on our allies who suffered so much? We cannot achieve our goals on the world stage if we undermine our credibility. And I'm deeply concerned by Turkey's decision to begin military operations in Syria. Civilians on both sides of the border have killed. Over 170,000 people have been displaced in the past 2 weeks in a region already experiencing a refugee crisis. The only people who benefit from more violence and more chaos are America's adversaries, Vladimir Putin, Bashar al-Assad, the terror-sponsoring dictatorship in Iran, and Islamist extremists in the area and around the world, as shown by the deal that Erdogan struck yesterday with Putin. Today, members will have the opportunity to ask our witnesses questions about the administration's approach to these critical issues, such as what are the implications of the past 2 weeks for the future of counter-ISIS operations and the global coalition to defeat ISIS? How will we prevent Assad from expanding his war against the Syrian people to northeast Syria? What are we doing to prevent Turkey from forcibly displacing Kurds and resettling Syrian refugees along the border? How can we prevent Iran and Russia from exploiting this situation to their benefit? Last week, I was pleased to see a strong bipartisan majority of the House pass a resolution that I authored with Chairman Engel, calling on Turkey to end this operation. Fortunately, I would say the Vice President Pence and Secretary Pompeo were successful in brokering a temporary ceasefire. But if Turkey continues its destructive campaign, we will quickly pass new bipartisan legislation that will bring hard-hitting sanctions against Erdogan's government. But I hope the ceasefire works. And I know, Ambassador Jeffrey, I really look forward to your testimony here today. I know you're going to give us some insight within the administration as to what has taken place the last 5 days with the ceasefire. I want to thank you, sir, for being here right now. I know there will be a press conference at the White House in probably 35 minutes. And let me just say also, sir, that I believe that you are the right man for this job at a very challenging time. And I personally want to thank you for your public service to this country and this nation. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. Now I'll introduce our witnesses. Ambassador James Jeffrey currently serves as the Secretary of State's Special Representative for Syria Engagement and the Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. He has held several senior national security positions, including Deputy National Security Advisor and Ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and Albania. Mr. Matthew Palmer currently serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs with responsibility for Turkey, the Western Balkans, and the Aegean. He previously was the Director of the Office of South Central Europe. He has served in Belgrade, Nicosia, the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, and various positions in Washington, including the Secretary's Policy Planning Staff and of the National Security Council. We also requested that the Department of Defense provide a witness for today's hearing, given their role in Syria and this committee's jurisdiction over war powers and U.S. intervention abroad. Unfortunately, after initially committing to send a witness, they failed to follow through, which is unacceptable. I don't intend to let it lie, and we'll deal with it in the future, but we're not going to accept it. However, I do want to thank the witnesses who have appeared here today. Without objection, all the witnesses' prepared testimony will be made part of the record, and I'll now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each to summarize their testimony. Let's start with Ambassador Jeffrey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the committee. It is an honor to be here today. Let me start with agreeing with the Chairman that the Turkish incursion into northeast Syria is a tragedy. It was a long-standing U.S. government policy in 2 administrations to keep that from happening, and we clearly were not successful. What I would like to do is to explain what we did when we were faced with this threat and what we have done since the Turks marched in. But first, I would like to turn to the larger situation that this is all embedded in northeast Syria, which is the Syrian crisis since 2011. That crisis brings together the 3 destructive forces in the Middle East. A local dictator who, as Ranking Member McCall said, is a threat to his own people more than a beneficiary to them, with half of the population having fled his misrule. An ideological state on the march, Iran, that has dug in Syria and threatened our neighbors, its neighbors, including Syria's neighbors, including Israel. And thirdly, various Islamic fundamentalist forces, terrorist forces that have also grown up in the midst of this Syrian civil war since 2011, including in particular ISIS, but there are others as well. American policy has been to pursue 3 objectives. First, the enduring defeat of ISIS, and secondarily other terrorist forces in Syria. Secondly, to find a political solution working with the UN and the international community to the civil conflict that would produce a different kind of government than the one we have right now with President Assad. And 3, to see the removal of all Iranian-commanded forces from Syria. They have no positive role whatsoever to play there. In pursuing that policy, much of our attention, of course, has been in northeast Syria, which is where we carried out, as Ranking Member McCall said, our very successful campaign against ISIS. But this was done with considerable friction from 2015 on with the important neighbor and NATO ally to the north, Turkey. Turkey long was very suspicious of the alliance we had with the local, largely Kurdish force, first the YPG, which is an offshoot of the PKK, the recognized terrorist group that has been trying to conduct an insurgency against Turkey for some almost 40 years, and various other allies that are organized into what we now call the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. For Turkey, for us, these were an ally, and a very good ally, against ISIS, a very effective ally that lost over 10,000 people killed. For Turkey, this was a threat to their borders. And our policy had been to try to find a way forward to balance Turkey's legitimate security concerns, our and the people of northeast Syria's legitimate security concerns, particularly against ISIS, but also to keep Turkey from going in, and our own interests, as I said, in pursuing ISIS and in finding a solution to the Syrian conflict that would, among other things, see the withdrawal of Iran. Turkey acted unwisely and against, as I'll get to in a second, our advice and very strong admonitions. In doing so, it represents another phenomenon we've run into elsewhere in the Middle East. That is, powerful neighboring states that have different interpretations of their own security interests than we do. We felt that we provided enough security that Turkey did not have to worry about its southern border, at least in the northeast, and did not have to worry about the SDF. Turkey, beginning with its leader, President Erdogan, and most of the population thought otherwise, and that was a tension that we dealt with, again, over 2 administrations. Things came to a head in October after we had actually worked an agreement with the Turks to do joint patrols and other joint activities in agreement with the SDF in a band that reached 30 kilometers deep along the whole northeast of northeast Syria. At that time, on the 6th of October, President Erdogan, in a call with President Trump, announced that he was going forward with an offensive. As President Trump indicated later that day in a press release, we had long known that Turkey was preparing for this thing. Turkey had had troops in place actually for almost a year and had been threatening to do this. Our position, provided to Turkey countless times, including by the President on the 6th of October, had 4 basic elements. One, and first of all, we did not approve of and would not in any way endorse such an operation. Secondly, even though requested by the Turks, we would not provide any support of any sort to such an operation. Thirdly, we would act to counter such an operation, but we would do so through diplomatic and other means, such as the sanctions that were mentioned by Congress and the sanctions that were immediately slapped on Turkey by the administration. But thirdly, and Turkey had long known this, we would not oppose a Turkish incursion by military means. I know of no decision at any point in either administration to use military force to deter Turkey from going into the northeast. We had done patrols in the Manbij area across the Euphrates at one point because we were concerned about Turkey coming in, but we never communicated to Turkey that we would use military force to stop them from moving across their border. Rather, we used diplomatic, economic, and other tools to persuade them that that would be a very bad decision, and it was a very bad decision. At this point, what we're focusing on is trying to stop this offensive. With the ceasefire that we negotiated on the 17th of October, we succeeded in getting Turkish forces to freeze in place. They called it a pause, while the YPG forces, which were the core Kurdish forces and the SDF, withdrew from the central portion of what we call a safe zone, essentially 130 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep in the middle of the northeast. Turkish forces, by and large, lived up to that, as did the YPG. And last night, the Turks announced that they would make this pause essentially permanent by halting their forces and ending their whole operation. So we saw that as a success. Meanwhile, Turkey tried to find ways that it could penetrate other parts of the northeast. President Erdogan yesterday went to Sochi, Russia, to talk with President Putin, and Putin would not allow the Turks to penetrate into the other areas, but rather they agreed on a joint patrolling regime rather similar to what we had in August with the YPG to pull back, supposedly, but we have to see the details of that agreement. Again, right now, the Northeast is quiet, other than some minor shooting and some minor movements between the Turkish and the YPG forces, and we expect it to stay quiet. What we're doing now is to urgently determine what our future policies are in the enduring defeat of ISIS, and we're considering options for our forces. The President has ordered all American forces in the Northeast on the ground to withdraw in a deliberate and orderly withdrawal that will take some time, but we're also looking at what the options are for military and other support to the SDF to continue the fight against ISIS and to maintain stability in the Northeast. Again, no final decisions have been taken. This is under review at this time. So I can't tell you what the decision will be, simply what the basic parameters are, what our goals are, and the various ways we're trying to achieve such a success. I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do not have a formal opening statement, but I do look forward to answering any questions members of the committee may have specific to the U.S.-Turkey bilateral relationship. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Ambassador Jeffrey, let me ask you this. According to media reports, including Fox News, President Trump went off script during the October 6th call in which he was supposed to tell Erdogan to stay north of the border. Instead, the president capitulated, gave the green light for Turkey to invade, then announced the United States would withdraw all troops from northeast Syria ahead of the Turkish operation. So let me ask you, first of all, were you consulted ahead of the October 6th call with President Erdogan? Could you push the button, please?
I was consulted almost daily on that and other Syria questions by Secretary of State Pompeo, and I know that Secretary Pompeo discussed this issue and many other issues on an almost daily basis with President Trump. This is something that we have been working on since President Trump first raised the issue publicly of withdrawing forces in the spring of 2018, and of course he had taken a decision to do so that we were slowly executing in December of 2018. So in that sense, yes, I was consulted.
Do you agree with the President's decision to abruptly announce the withdrawal of U.S. forces in Syria following the October 6th call?
It is the duty of a commander-in-chief to make such decisions with the support or the consultation of the U.S. Congress and the American people. It's not my job to decide on whether we should keep troops in a very dangerous situation or not. My job is to explain what will happen if you do pull these troops out. And the President was well aware that with the troops being withdrawn, we would have less ability to work with the SDF against the remnants of ISIS. But he also, as the Commander-in-Chief, had as his first responsibility force protection for our troops. We had a situation, we knew that the SDF would ask for the Russians and the Syrians to come in, and they did so. And we had told the Turks that would be a direct result if they came in. We had Turkish troops and Turkish-supported, very, very dangerous and, in some cases, extremist opposition elements coming in. And the President had a responsibility to keep his forces out of the way. That was a major consideration in his decisions, including withdrawing forces.
I'm glad that Vice President Pence was able to negotiate a ceasefire temporarily so that our Turkish allies could get out of their territory with their lives intact. But aren't we really aiding and abetting ethnic cleansing by allowing them to do that?
We haven't seen any widespread ethnic cleansing in that area since the Turks have come in. Many people fled because they're very concerned about these Turkish-supported Syrian opposition forces, as are we. We've seen several incidents which we consider war crimes. But we have, as part of the agreement with Turkey, specific language on the proper care of civilians and a monitoring responsibility that we have to work with the Turks to ensure that exactly that doesn't happen in that area.
But it is true that as a result of Turkey's actions, over 176,000 Syrian Kurds have been forcibly displaced, which amounts to a concerted effort to displace Kurds from their native lands. So again, sounds like ethnic cleansing to me.
The numbers are correct, but in the area that the Turks came into, Mr. Chairman, that is mainly an Arab area. We didn't do a survey of who these people are, but as I said, most of the people in that area are ethnic Arab, not ethnic Kurdish. And they withdrew on their own. There was no effort that we saw to try to push them out. Now, it could be that the behavior on those incidents that we saw and other incidents that we may learn about soon provoked some departures of people, but we saw no widespread effort to try to push people out of their homes in that area where the Turks moved into.
But how will, two questions. How will the U.S. counter increased Russian, Iranian, and Assad regime influence and control, which are directly from the result of the U.S. withdrawal, and what is left to prevent the Turks, the Turkish military, and its affiliated militias from continuing to ethnically cleanse northeast Syria of Kurds?
Again, through diplomatic means. The thing that provoked all of this was the very unwise, very tragic Turkish insertion into northeast Syria. That provoked a whole series of events that we're discussing today. As I said, we have stemmed that Turkish movement forward through this agreement. And right now we're going to work with the Turks and the Russians. We don't work with the Syrian regime and our SDF partners to continue the fight against Daesh and to try to do exactly those things that you said to maintain stability. We have had some successes with the Russians in Syria, and we've had some failures with them in stabilizing areas. We'll see how this one works out.
Well, let me ask you this. Yesterday, in testimony to the Senate, you confirmed the State Department is aware of, you said, dozens of detained ISIS fighters that escaped SDF custody following the Turkish incursion. Also, yesterday, Secretary Esper stated to CNN that a bit more than 100 ISIS detainees have escaped. We know from previous briefings these ISIS detainees are among the most dangerous fighters intent on attacking the United States and our allies. So let me ask you this. How many ISIS detainees have escaped? Does the U.S. have an idea where these individuals are? And is the U.S. able to monitor or effectively operate against ISIS given the withdrawal of U.S. forces?
Yeah, again, as Secretary Esper said, we would say that the number is now over 100. We do not know where they are. Almost all of the prisons that the SDF were guarding are still secured. The SDF still has people there. We're monitoring that as best we can. We still have forces in Syria working with the SDF, and one of the top priorities is these prisons.
Let me just say in conclusion that I think what we did is so catastrophic, and it really affects our ability to operate in that part of the world. It affects our ability to be effective in that part of the world. I always speak my mind on foreign policy. I don't care what administration it is or what party the administration comes from. I didn't particularly like the Iranian agreement, and I spoke out and voted against it. I think what happened here with the removal of American troops is catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic, and has the worst repercussions for this country for days and weeks and months to come. I'm just sick over it. And I think that's why we got this, a strong bipartisan resolution in the Congress condemning it. And I just, I've been here a long time. I hardly remember policy that's been as bad as this, in my opinion. So thank you. Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, I just want to give you an opportunity to clarify what I think has been very confusing about what took place over the last week or so. We were in the White House, the chairman and I, with the President, Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, General Milley. And I know the President had a conversation with Erdogan. There's been this talk of green lights being given to allow the Turks to come in and invade Syria. But then when I talked to General Milley, he told me that it was his recommendation because the Turks were threatening our soldiers and that they were in harm's way. So can you perhaps add some clarity to how this decision was made and what actually happened?
Sure. It's a little hard to do this without a map, but I'll try.
And I think we do have a map, and I want to turn to that in a minute, but this is more of a sequence of events in terms of this Turkish invasion.
Okay. First of all, I think to set the record straight, I know of no American policy or commitment by anyone in a position to give a commitment, and that's a senior official, military, civilian, to either Turkey or to our SDF partners, that we would use American military force to stop a Turkish incursion into northeast Syria. On, I think it was a Stephanopoulos show on Sunday, former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter from the Obama administration said that explicitly. Our commander at that time in the field, Tony Thomas, a little bit later on Face the Nation, made similar comments when he was pressed. He said, well, we talked to the Kurds about, the Kurds, we mean by that the SDF, about a possible role that we wanted in a future democratic Syria through the UN process and such. But I know of no commitment to protect them by military force, nor did I ever see any indication that the Turks felt that we were using military force to protect them. In fact, what you had was, as you look at the map, most of the American forces in Syria were along the Euphrates, south of that reservoir, because that's where ISIS is, and that's where most of the SDF forces were too, fighting the remnants of ISIS. You had a small American force in Manbij across the Euphrates to the west, and just to the east of the Euphrates in Kobani, you had an American air base, essentially, and a logistical and command and control headquarters. That was where many of the American forces were. That is, there were no American forces in that area that is now kind of blue, where the Turks came in, other than two outposts that had been put out there back in November of 2018, largely because of shelling from the Turkish side into Syria and accusations from the Turks that they were being fired on and that they wanted to return fire. So we said, we'll put some observation posts out to see who's firing at who to ascertain that. We never told the Turks that those two observation posts were a defense against Turkey coming over. They had about 12 people in each. Covering a perimeter, well, it was the third one, but between the three, it was about 300 kilometers. Nobody on the Turkish side ever thought that that was a deterrent or that was a signal that we would stop them militarily. My
time's going to expire. Okay. I have several other questions, but I think maybe you could clarify for the record the sequence of events and how this decision was made to withdraw. And I think that, as we talked before, there was no green light given to the Turks. I think they were going to invade one way or the other, it sounds like, and now we have to make this ceasefire happen. What I did stress with both General Milley, the SecDef, and the President was I don't want to make the same mistake we made in Iraq. 10,000 troops, ISIS formation, caliphate. I was promised that we were not going to withdraw from Syria, that there would be a residual force to protect the homeland. Is that still the case today, and where would that residual force be in Syria?
We are working on possible options. I can't commit to a final decision on a residual force in the Northeast. The President did decide that we would keep our force in Al-Tanf. Al-Tanf is that blue area at the bottom of the Syrian map. That decision has been taken. We did not take a decision one way or the other on air, and a decision on whether we would keep some forces on basically in the eastern half of the yellow area is still under review at the highest level.
I was with the General CENTCOM. He said he's going to recommend to SecDef where the oil fields are in the northeastern quadrant of Syria, correct?
That is my understanding, but again, these are recommendations that are still part of internal
I hope the President takes that advice. Who's going to fill the vacuum?
That's one reason why we're doing this review, to see how we and our SDF forces, almost all of whom are intact, because the fighting did not, we think that the casualties on the SDF were in the hundreds in the battle with the Turks. So they're still a force in being of many tens of thousands. At one point, there were 100,000.
I think the Russians and Assad and Iran are going to fill the vacuum. That's my opinion. Refugees. Is there any threat that Turkey's going to dump their 4 million refugees in this northern buffer zone?
We never thought that that was a realistic option, and we told the Turks that many times.
So there's been some discussion, and you can clarify that there's going to be 20 miles, 20 kilometers, or 30 kilometers into Syria, this northern buffer zone. Then it was just the middle part. Now it's the entire northern part of Syria. What is the final agreement that was reached between Putin and Erdogan with respect to how large of a swath are we talking about?
Again, where you see the blue in the middle, that's roughly the area that we have our agreement with the Turks. To the west and to the east of that, all the way to the Euphrates and all the way to the Iraqi border, and in two areas to the west of the Euphrates, that's Manbij, right north of the reservoir, and a small area, Tal Rabat, near Aleppo. The agreement is that the Russian military police and some Assad border police would escort or find some way to negotiate for the YPG/SDF to depart. In the case of the Northeast, they would pull back 30 kilometers, and that for 10 kilometers south of the Turkish border, there would be eventually Russian Turkish patrols.
So it's gone from 30 now to 10 kilometers, so it's a smaller buffer zone, right?
It's not only smaller, but this idea of having done joint patrols with the Turks and seen how difficult it is, essentially the Turks have no territory passed to them as part of this agreement with the Russians.
Final question, the prisons, who is securing the prisons with 10,000 of the worst of ISIS?
The SDF are still securing the
Do we feel confident they can do that?
We are confident at this point that they are doing that.
Okay, I yield back.
Thank you. Before I call on our next member, I have to just say, Ambassador Jeffrey, you have a very hard job in defending what's not defendable. And I, again, want to just voice my disgust with what the President did and allowed to happen. I think that it will affect us for years and years and decades to come, and I think we'll go back down as one of the major American blunders in history. I just think what we've done there is shameful. Mr. Siris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador, I have a picture here that was yesterday in the Washington Post. I know you can't see it. I could get a larger one. But basically is Trump, Putin, Erdogan. And the president's got his arm around Putin. To me, I find this picture disgusting. This is a man who is hell-bent on destroying democracies, hell-bent on destroying America, and we always seem to give in to him. This is the man that now that we have a void there, is going to move in there. He's creating problems all over the world. He's now in the Western Hemisphere, creating problems in Venezuela. It's all to destroy our democracy. And I cannot, for the life of me, understand why this president is so, I don't know, it's like his best buddy. This is not someone that's out to help us or work with us. It's out to destroy us. I grew up in a communist country before coming here. And this is the guy that was the KGB. Now he's the leader of the Communist Party. He's the one that was going to put nuclear weapons 90 miles from this country. When is this president going to wake up to the fact that this guy is not our friend? I think he's playing him like a fiddle. And this decision to abandon the Kurds plays right up to him. And Iran and Erdogan. Maybe there's no cleansing going on now, but there's a history in Turkey of doing cleansing, especially with the Armenians. So I am concerned that maybe not now because the world's eyes are all over him, but sooner or later he's going to start his cleansing and taking more territory. And what are we going to do about it? We have no real way of stopping them. And you know what's more disgusting? I saw pictures yesterday in the news, people throwing potatoes at our armed forces. Someone who relishes this country, it just turned my stomach yesterday that are people that are armed forces who have defended this country for forever, defended democracy, and we have people throwing potatoes. I don't know about this president, but I have to tell you, the military cannot be happy with this guy. So, I mean, I have a ton of questions to ask you, but who's going to fill it? What are we going to do? And you know what's wrong with you saying that we're going to sit down and figure out the policy from now on? Doesn't make any sense, because with this president, one phone call, and he changes. He doesn't take advice from the people who know. This guy can't even run a casino in New Jersey, let alone a foreign policy that is so important to this country. So when you say to me that we're now evaluating what are we going to do, look, I get it. You are a professional. You are a smart man. You're a credit to this country, and you have a very hard job to do. But I just don't believe that anything or any policies that people put together is going to make any difference to this president. I'm very concerned about America. Very, very concerned. Because we are the bastion where people look up to us. Everywhere around the world, nobody's trusting us because of the decisions that are being made by the White House, not necessarily by the people who know. So, Ambassador, I feel that you have a very difficult job, and I know you'll do the best you can for this country. But again, this picture just turned my stomach when I saw it, and I apologize if I give you a tirade, and I have no questions. Now,
I understand, Congressman. One comment. My instructions from Secretary Pompeo from day one, and I have every reason to believe they were to him from President Trump, was to act to counter Russia's effort in the Syrian conflict to obtain a military victory for Assad and his Iranian henchmen. And that's what I was doing every day, and that's what my orders remain to do, at least on the Syrian account. On others, you have to ask other people up here for their problems, because I'm pretty occupied with this one. And that's a big part of my mission, is to contain Russia.
well, I thank you for your for your hard work.
Mr. Chris Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. Thank you for your service to our two distinguished witnesses. You know, back in 1991, tens of thousands of Kurds fleeing Saddam Hussein traveled to the Turkish border. They were blocked from gaining entry. President George Herbert Walker Bush initiated Operation Provide Comfort, largely organized out of Incirlik. It provided massive amounts of food, clothing, and shelter. U.S. Special Forces saved probably thousands, certainly hundreds from exposure and sickness before the NGOs could kick in. I traveled with a group of members to the border back then. Biggest takeaway, the Turks absolutely refused to help men, women, and innocent children. And secondly, they were seething with animosity towards the Kurds. Now, I'm telling you something that you already know. Most people, I think, know it as well. But I was struck by that animosity. Remind me of the hatred they had for the Armenians that led to the Armenian genocide. It was just seething. One man took a meal ready to eat, MRE, from a pallet left there by our government, by our military, and they shot him in cold blood the day after we left. Fast forward to now, when given the opportunity, they will seize it. So I have a couple of questions. My good colleagues before me had asked many of the questions that I have. But frankly, I'd like to ask about the use of white phosphorus, a terrible, terrible chemical agent. When it's used for camouflage, it's one thing. When it's used to kill innocent people, and there's at least some indications that it's been used against at least 6 people who inhaled it. The Red Crescent, for the Kurdish Red Crescent, said 6 patients with burns are watching. If so, this is a war crime. I wonder what you could tell us about that. On sanctions, you know, the PACT Act and a bill as well introduced by Liz Cheney makes clear that we want sanctions. One goes further and says even Erdogan should be sanctioned. But there was the sanctions put out by the president, Executive Order 13894. If you could speak to that, how well that's being implemented, which went after the defense minister and the interior minister. It ought to go right to the top, I would respectfully submit. Erbil, I've been to Erbil. I know the Kurds there and the Christian the Yazidis who fled, obviously, for their lives from ISIS. They've been very much concerned about an incursion there. Your thoughts on what happens there? Again, if you could speak to this use of weapons. And finally, in both bills, the chairman's bill, and Mr. McCall, of course, is the lead Republican sponsor. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor as well. Also talks about denying military assistance to Turkey. Both bills do it. Do you think that's a prudent act? We all remember back in '74 when the Turks went into Cyprus. They used our material, what we provided, to suppress Cyprus and to kill many. We ought to hold them to account, and I do hope Section 4 of both bills has that sanctions on providing any kind of military assistance to Turkey. Your thoughts on that?
On the white phosphorus, we have seen one report of the use of white phosphorus. We're looking into that. White phosphorus is tricky because, as you indicated, it has military uses, and you have to almost determine not what happened, but what the intent was. But as I said, we're looking into that. There was only one incident of that, I believe. In terms of the sanctions that we imposed on 3 ministers and 2 ministries on the 14th of October, on the basis of the executive order that was published that day for Syria sanctions because of the incursion. We started implementing it immediately. As part of the agreement with Turkey on the 17th of October, last Thursday, we agreed not to impose any new sanctions under that executive order. And based upon the fact that the Turks have declared, in accordance with our agreement, that their offensive is over, what they call Peace Spring, as of last night, we're about, I believe, to lift those sanctions. But I want to underline, the sanction executive order remains in place. We can, just as quick as we did last time, impose new sanctions under that executive order if we're not happy with the behavior of the Turks or anybody else that is covered in that very, very broad and very, very powerful sanctions instrument. In terms of congressional sanctions, again, there are a number of them out there. I saw how helpful they were in getting the Turks to a ceasefire. But I have to say that we would want to look at these very, very carefully for two reasons. First of all, we are concerned about very important military relations and very positive ones that we do have with Turkey. And secondly, as a general rule, we see sanctions as incentives to change behavior, which means that there has to be waivers or other presidential decision-making involved, executive branch involved in such sanctions. If there are no waivers, if it is absolute, even when the behavior is changed, it is often very hard to get these things lifted, and then we have the worst of two worlds. We don't get the behavior changed, and we're punishing people that in other places and on other issues we want to work with.
Thank you. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Jeffrey, Mr. Palmer, thanks for being here. Thanks for your service. Ambassador Jeffrey, were you on the October 6th call with President Erdogan?
I was not.
Mr. Palmer, were you?
No, sir.
Do you know, Ambassador Jeffrey, do you have a list of who was on that call?
I do not.
Is it possible for you to get that list?
As a general rule, we do not publish who is on the list of people who listen to the President's telephone.
I understand. Is it possible to get a transcript of that call, Ambassador Jeffrey?
That you would have to ask of the White House. Again,
We've asked, there's a request in, but is there any reason not to provide that?
As a general reason, executive privilege covers that.
I understand as a general rule, in light of this conversation, I hope you can understand why we think it's so important. Ambassador Jeffrey, in testimony before this committee in May, you stated that the administration is pursuing three mutually reinforcing whole-of-government strategic objectives: the enduring defeat of ISIS, the removal of all Iranian-led forces from Syria, and the resolution of the Syrian crisis through a political solution. Your written statement submitted today claimed these three objectives remain the goals. So I just have some questions. Does the rapid removal of U.S. troops from northeastern Syria make a revival of ISIS more or less likely?
Congressman, those troops were sent in harm.
Ambassador Jeffrey, I'm just asking, your opinion, does it make it more or less likely that ISIS will be reconstituted?
Well, not in my opinion. It was U.S. government policy. We had.
I understand the policy. Do you think it's more or less likely that ISIS will reconstitute as a result of this decision?
If those troops are withdrawn fully, a very important tool we had to keep ISIS under control will be gone. That is correct.
That would make it more likely. Does the withdrawal of U.S. troops make reducing and expelling Iranian influence from Syria more or less likely?
That's a tougher one to give you a yes or no on, because that was not the mission of the troops, particularly in the Northeast.
I understand. I understand. It's tougher, but this is you're in charge of Syria policy. Iran and the threat that Iran poses in Syria is of vital interest to me and this committee, so I'm just asking your conclusion here.
Right, and I'll stick with the troops were there to participate in de-ISIS, and removing them.
I understand.
Is a challenge to that mission.
Is it a challenge also to preventing Iran from establishing greater influence?
It is a challenge to maintaining stability in the Northeast, which in turn pushes Syria in a good direction.
I'll take that as a yes. Does the removal of U.S. troops diminish or strengthen our ability to shape an ultimate political solution to the conflict?
The troops were not the primary tool.
I understand. I understand, and I have great appreciation for all you do. I'm just asking about this decision and whether this decision to remove the troops without consultation with our allies and to do it as rapidly as we did and to turn our back on the Kurds and everything that we've discussed already today, does it diminish or strengthen our ability to shape a political solution to the conflict?
Our focus on the troops, the withdrawal, and what we might do, including looking again at the withdrawal, is mainly focused on the de-ISIS issues. We can find other ways to pursue our broader.
So we're just as strong, our diplomatic ability is just as strong. Is your testimony that our diplomatic ability is just as strong today as it was before we removed our troops?
We will have to make certain adjustments to our policies on the basis of that.
Ambassador Jeffrey, yesterday you told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the President did not consult you, his point person on Syria, before this decision. When was the last time you briefed the President on your efforts as Special Representative for Syria?
I've never briefed the President, nor would I have expected to brief the President. I work for Mike Pompeo.
And when was the last time you briefed Secretary Pompeo?
Almost daily for the last 14 months.
Including October 5th? Was there a briefing on October 5th or October 6th, the day before or the day of the call?
I'm almost certain that between the 4th and the 6th, I had at least one conversation with him.
And was Secretary Pompeo consulted before the president made this decision?
You'd have to ask Secretary Pompeo that specific question. What I can say for the record is Secretary Pompeo has been consulted very, very frequently, almost daily, by the president on Syria issues, and the question of U.S. forces there has been a very important part of that discussion.
Here, I appreciate it, Ambassador Jeffrey. Before we wrap up, I just want to flag a few things that you've said today. I note the contrast between seeing it as a success that Putin, you said, would not allow them to go into other areas, wouldn't allow them. In our case, you said that Turkey acted unwisely, and they acted against our advice. It was our advice that they not do what they did. And if it was our policy, as you said, that throughout this entire presence in Syria, throughout the entire presence, all we were doing was advising, and the moment, and is it your testimony that because we never intended to use our troops to defend the Kurds, that the moment Erdogan made a phone call to President Trump and said, I'm going in, this was always the inevitable result?
Yeah, I knew I was going to get in trouble when I said Putin wouldn't allow. By that sense, I mean Putin has certain diplomatic and economic
I understand.
pressure.
Leave Putin out. If you could answer my question, was it inevitable? Since all we were doing was offering advice, and as you testified today, we were never going to defend the Kurds militarily. Was it simply inevitable that eventually this was going to be the result of our policy? Is that what you're testifying to?
No, not at all. Quite the contrary. We had, first of all, the president had very powerful tools to be used both as incentives and sticks with Turkey, including the CAATSA sanctions, including a $100 billion trade package, including a visit to the United States. These were all raised in the October 6th call.
And
so the idea was...
And then I would just conclude, Mr. Chairman. I mean, ultimately, if we had all these tools, then the president either failed to utilize them or he simply rolled over for Erdogan. Isn't that right?
No, I would say a third alternative.
Yeah.
That is that the Turkish government made a terribly bad and very, very dangerous decision.
That's resulted in not, as you've said, not widespread ethnic cleansing, but at least apparently some ethnic cleansing. And there was a reference, he said, to war crimes, and to the extent there are war crimes, is there, my last question, is there consideration of taking Turkey to The Hague if war crimes have been committed?
On the war crimes, we're looking into those allegations, and we actually have a set of packages. We've taken steps we've sent a high-level démarche to Ankara demanding an explanation, and we'll look at the various options. But you're absolutely right. One reason we tried so hard to stop the Turks from coming in is that we knew it could lead to all of the things you mentioned and more.
Right. I'm sorry they didn't take our advice. I yield back.
Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have the utmost respect for you and my colleagues on the other side, Mr. Cyrus. But I find the level of hypocrisy is nowhere close to bipartisanship in here. You know, what I see is you don't like President Trump, you don't like his policies, and I hear that coming out through the last member that testified. President Trump, you said, through his action has created a humanitarian crisis. That's terrible. I agree there is a humanitarian crisis, but there's been a civil war going on over there for over 8 years. 800,000 people have died, the largest exodus of people on the planet since World War II.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will yield if I reclaim my time.
I would be more than willing to engage in a discussion about whether this action to withdraw our troops at this moment, turning our back on the Kurds, has created a humanitarian crisis for the Kurds. And if the gentleman is suggesting it hasn't, then perhaps that's worthy of a longer conversation.
I'll reclaim my time, and I'm happy to do that, and I think we should do a special order on this. But to say that President Trump has caused this, I think is erroneous. Mr. Cyrus, you're saying that how the picture of Putin and Trump and Erdogan was terrible. Did you feel that way about this picture with President Obama and Raul Castro? You know, so the hypocrisy.
May I answer you?
Go ahead, since
You know that I did. Okay.
But I don't hear it. I don't hear it. You know, it's like
No,
it's
but
okay
you
there,
on
okay.
the committee with me, and you know
I am on the
I didn't
committee.
disagree.
I'm reclaiming my time.
Good.
So, Ambassador Jeffries, You stated that Turkey had been staged in the northeast area for approximately a year. Is that true?
Turkey had what in the Northeast?
And they've been staged there with troops and...
Right, along the border, they had threatened to go in if they couldn't get certain concessions that we would not make to deal with what they saw was a existential problem of 100,000 people under, again, what they thought was PKK control.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, Ms. Palmer, because you look lonely there. Since you said you were the number guy, how many troops did they have there in the northeast area of Syria?
I apologize, Congressman, but I can't give you a hard number on that. I have to get back to you.
Ambassador Jeffrey?
It was 25,000 across
25,000
Yeah,
troops.
that is at this point, but they had, the numbers fluctuated between the fall of 2018 and at present it was about 25,000.
All right, let me ask you this. How many troops did the U.S. have in that area where Turkey was going in to do what they did here?
Again, I have the answer. I'll get to the answer. It was.
Was it thousands?
It was less than 30. But again,
less than 30
their mission
troops.
was not. This is not even apples and oranges. It's kind of apples and I don't know rocks.
All right. So the troops we're talking about withdrawing are approximately 30 in that area, right?
Right. But one of the problems, to be honest, is when we talk about withdrawals. In all of this discussion, we're talking about two withdrawals.
Right.
A very specific withdrawal on the 6th of October on General Miley's recommendation of those two tiny outposts because they were in the area where they were
of approximately 30 troops.
Right. And then there was the overall withdrawal of everybody, which was a separate decision taken some time later.
I just want to get things in perspective. So this was not a massive troop withdrawal in that area. Now, there are 2,000 troops that are going to be removed later on, correct?
It was under 1,000 troops, although they had been reinforced.
It is not a massive, and I agree, the Kurds have to be protected in some form. How long have we talked about creating a safe zone in the northeast corridor of Syria and Turkey?
We've had conversations on doing something like that since the Obama administration.
Right. I've been here for 7 years, and we've talked about a safe zone, a free safe zone between that area so that we can put refugees in that area so that they're protected. Is that what's happening between Russia and Erdogan now, or Erdogan? They're talking about a safe zone, that 20-mile area roughly?
I have to be pretty cynical about this agreement.
I'm going to be real cynical about it, but if they can accomplish that, isn't that what we've been trying to do?
They're not going to accomplish anything good with that agreement, Congressman.
Well, and that goes to the underlying problem. There is not a good solution to the Syrian outcome because you have Assad. He's trying to, fight the ISIS rebels, and he's, doing genocide over there. Then you have Turkey trying to get Assad out for their reasons. You've got Russia propping up Assad for their reasons, and they're going to work with Turkey that wants to get rid of Assad. Then you have Iran in there for their reason, working against us. So I think any way that we can get out of there with protection to the Kurds and give them as much support, but God help them and the other people, because we have to look at the genesis of how we got into Syria and why we got into Syria, and it was the rapid withdrawal of massive amounts of troops coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq that created the void that ISIS filled, and then the no-fly zones in Libya that took out Gaddafi's defense that allowed ISIS to have training camps and recruitment camps that went into Syria that allowed them to get to where they're at. So we're dealing with the aftermath of poor foreign policy. We need to get the hell out of there as quick as we can and let Russia own it. They did such a great job in Afghanistan that let them do it again. And the Americans need to come back, and we need to focus on the Western Hemisphere and other things. I've rested my time.
Thank you. Mr. Berra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like my colleague from Florida, Mr. Yoho, and I think he did articulate a little bit of how I think President Trump is looking at this foreign policy and looking at U.S. engagement in the Middle East. We don't have to guess that the president's wanted to get out of Syria for a while. He campaigned on it. Last December, I happened to be in the region, met with our commanders in the field, met with our special envoy at that time, Brett McGurk, returned back home, and the following week, the president, issued his famous tweet now that said, "We're getting out of Syria." Nobody seemed to know that was coming. Nobody in the field. The special envoy certainly didn't, because he wrote it in an op-ed, and there were some moderating forces that were able to slow the president down and walk that back and try to think about this strategically. So while I was shocked by the decision a few weeks ago, I wasn't surprised by that decision. And if we're going to change our foreign policy approach to the Middle East and the region, we ought to have a concrete discussion that involves this body. The fact that, that we took a big vote last week, and the majority of Republicans expressed their displeasure with the decision and the rapidity of the decision, suggests that this body, both the House and Senate, are not in favor. I don't disagree that the president has the ability to set out and change foreign policy, but there's a real danger if we do it rapidly, and then if a new administration comes in and we try to reverse it. We ought to have a real honest conversation about how we approach this region. Because the reality is what's happened in the last couple of weeks has strengthened Assad. So if our policy is we're not going to do business with Assad, we're not going to support a Syrian solution that includes Assad, well, we just went in the wrong direction. If we do think of Russia as an adversary and we don't want to cede influence and control in the Middle East to Russia, well, we just went in the opposite direction. So our foreign policy in this region is changing. When the president says, well, it's not our issue, that's 7,000 or 9,000 miles away, the reality is ISIS is most effective and the biggest threat to us here. Yeah, they're fighting over there and they're committing atrocities over there, but they are also very effective in the use of propaganda, very effective in the use of identifying individuals in Europe, individuals in the United States, building a relationship with those folks online, and creating homegrown terrorism. Well, we just ceded that and we just went backwards on our ability there. So we have to have an honest conversation about what our long-term strategy is, not with a Democratic president or Republican president, but long-term, because the Middle East is not going to get resolved in the next 4 years or the next 8 years. This is a long-term issue, and I think every Syrian expert, and again, Ambassador Jeffrey, I think you'd probably agree with this, there's not an easy solution to Syria with the number of refugees, with the amount of devastation, and with the political instability there. Would you disagree with me that this is a time, if we're rethinking foreign policy, the Middle East administration ought to have this conversation with Congress and we ought to all get on the same page?
Absolutely. Decisions taken on the Middle East, given its impact on our own security, from world energy supplies, which still impact us despite our energy situation here, to the threat of terrorism and the threat of weapons of mass destruction and radical forces on the march, affect the American people, not just us in the administration. And we cannot do our job without the resources, the legal basis, and other authorities that we can only get through Congress. That's one reason why in a little over 6 months I've been up here before this committee 3 times and have talked with many of you on the side. We do believe in this. Obviously, as I said, we did not want this to happen. This has been a significant setback, and that is obvious and clear in how we put out the executive order describing the impact of this Turkish move. It is good that we look into how this decision came, how this event came about, what we did right, what we did wrong. That's what I'm trying to do today. What I want to underline, though, is 2 things. One, we did not, whatever else we may have done or not done, we did not give a green light to this operation. Okay. And secondly, on this one issue, U.S. policy in Syria and U.S. forces and whether they should be in Syria or not, there was almost obsessive reviews, consultations, and discussions at every level of the U.S. government. It was not something that was done serendipity.
Was Congress part of those discussions?
Certainly, it was part of my discussions up here 3 times.
Yeah, well, I would make the case that the administration ought to spend more time with the relevant committees in Congress in consultation so that Congress and the administration can be on the same page so that when we're projecting to the rest of the world what our foreign policy objectives in that region are, we're all speaking from the same page.
Understand, sir.
Thank you. And let me express my frustration again that Congress was not a part of that discussion. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being here. I appreciate your great service. I don't envy you having to sit in that chair right now, but I appreciate being willing to do it. I want to be clear about the green light. I have to take issue. I think this absolutely was a green light. Maybe the phone call didn't say, yeah, go do it. It was a proverbial green light if we want to parse words. I talked to a leader of a European NATO country that told me, or a foreign minister that told me that, he said, you know, Turkey may have attacked 100 of my troops there, but he said they never would have attacked 24 or 25 American troops backed by American air power and American security. And we all know that's true. I don't think anybody would really would think that had the president put a hard line down that they would have attacked. This is a moral question to me. A couple of points I want to make, and then I do have a couple of quick questions. First off, this idea of war fatigue that is being told over and over to us. You know, it's like when your grandma tells you you're tired and need a nap. Eventually you feel tired and need a nap. That's what's happening right now in the political discussion. This country is not war fatigued. War fatigue came after World War II when we should have left or could have left Europe and left it to those people over there 5,000 miles away. And instead, we made a commitment after entire towns of young men were lost in World War II to stay and stand for American values. The military's job is not to be protected only. The military's job, when people say we want to protect the military as the chief goal, the military's job is to do what 99.9% of Americans don't want to or should never be asked to do. These are young men and women that voluntarily sign up to do the dirty work of American security to make sure that Americans are not hurt. And so using military troops as the excuse to reinvigorate ISIS, and look, the president didn't intentionally reinvigorate ISIS, I want to be clear, but that is not the end goal. We have the luxury now in this country of not thinking about terrorism because we have not been attacked on our soil in a big way in 19 years. That's not because the intentions of the terrorists changed. It's because we have destroyed their ability to do it. We hear the Forever War Caucus that uses cheap slogans and sayings come out and say things like forever wars. By the way, this is the exact model they advocated for, so we didn't have to put 150,000 troops in Syria. This is it. But the Forever War Caucus forgets that it's not their choice. The terrorists have decided to commit a forever war against us. And we can do that in spurts every time we get hit. 20 years later we pull back, we get hit again. Or we can stay on the offense, which is my preference. So I think this was a major mistake, and Mr. Ambassador, I totally respect you're doing your job defending this, but I do have a couple of very quick questions on this. Specifically, our visibility on ISIS after the pullout. Did we lose or gain visibility on the location of ISIS and their objectives after this?
Again, the pullout has just begun, and the troops that we pulled out, you saw the convoys and such, were not the folks in the field advising, assisting, and accompanying.
But they can get intelligence.
Right, yeah. I mean, obviously, there is when you pull out command and control and communications, you lose certain things. But I want to underline today we have people out there with the SDF pursuing ISIS.
And then, secondly, is this a moral victory to ISIS? I guess if you're a recruiter for ISIS, and you say, yeah, the caliphate was defeated, but now we're going to be reinvigorated. This is exactly what was foretold. We would go through tough times, but we're going to reinvigorate now. Do you think our pullout actually helped the recruiting efforts or hindered that?
ISIS is pitching this as a victory for them.
And do you think, is it true that, did Turkey, let me ask this, did Turkey threaten to attack even if we didn't withdraw our troops? Maybe you don't know.
I do. I
Okay.
mean, and some of it I can't say here, but everything I know, including the things I can't say here, is absolutely consistent with what I'm telling you and from the open sources. There was never a consideration in the Turkish decision chain about U.S. forces being in the way or anything else because they never felt that they were being blocked by the U.S. forces.
I appreciate that. So that I would take that personally. You don't have to say it. I would take that as a threat. If they're going to move anyway, our troops are there. They would take that as a threat. They told the president. That, first off, is a NATO ally. So as we talk about sanctions here and there's discussion about maybe we shouldn't do it, NATO basically threatened to overrun U.S. positions. That didn't change with a ceasefire. And so I look at that and I'm like, well, that's interesting to me. You know, it's interesting when we look at what a NATO ally did as we talk about, well, they have a ceasefire with Russia now, not with us. Maybe we could have, like, negotiated something, but probably this is bad enough that we never would be a party to it. It's an interesting thing to keep in mind as we deal with what to do. Look, we're in a tough position now, a lot of tough decisions. I couldn't even give you an answer that I think is right now on where to go forward. But I think as this body decides what to do in terms of future behavior, I think taking a strong stand and saying the United States will not be pushed over without consequences is important. To both of you, again, deeply respect you being here and your hard work. I know you've put in a lot more time in this than I could ever even imagine doing myself. So God bless you and thank you for your service. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for your testimonies. Mr. Jeffries, Ambassador Jeffries, could you shed light, a little bit more details on how toxic or how conflictive is the historical relationship between Turkey and the Kurds?
I could, but technically my colleague, Mr. Palmer, is responsible for Turkish things, and he's dying to answer this question, Mr.
Good.
Thank you, Congressman. There has been a long-standing confrontation between Turkey and the PKK. Over the last 4 decades, there have been as many as 40,000 casualties in Turkey of Turkish civilians, Turkish police, Turkish military, as a function of that conflict with the PKK, which Turkey considers an existential threat. The PKK is not the same thing as the Kurds. There's a very large Kurdish community in Turkey, much of which is very well integrated into Turkish society, considers themselves Turkish citizens, participate fully.
But the Turkish military clearly has a great military advantage over the Kurds.
Congressman, I'm not entirely certain what you mean by the Kurds in this context, if you're referring to the SDF-YPG in
yes, that's correct.
Northeast Syria. Yes, that's absolutely true. Turkey is a NATO member, has a significant military and significant military capabilities.
So given this historical conflict between the Kurds and Turkey and the fact that the Turkish military has this clear advantage, it is safe to say that the Turkish forces up there in the border are in clear and imminent danger if they would stay there and face a Turkish incursion or military action.
Congressman, I think there's a sensible reason as to why the SDF has chosen to withdraw from those positions.
And our presence there obviously contributed to providing some level of safety and security for those minority groups that are at a clear military disadvantage, correct?
Congressman, I think that Ambassador Jeffries' testimony was quite clear on this point, that there was never any commitment that was made on the part of the U.S. military or U.S. civilian leadership to have U.S. military in place in northeast Syria to defend the SDF-YPG from Turkey.
But our presence there creates a message, if you may, to the Turkish government that we're concerned about that region, that's a troubled region of the world, and that, in fact, we want some level of peace and coherence there, correct?
We have an ongoing conversation with Turkey and Turkish authorities about the issue of northeast Syria, our interests in that region, and our concerns about Turkish aspirations.
What are your, to any of, you're not off the hook yet, Ambassador. What is your opinion, either one of you, of the potential for what many have described as either ethnic cleansing or maybe even genocide in the area?
In Syria?
In the region, the conflict region, in the border.
In any region, yeah. in that region in particular.
In that region in particular.
You're always facing the possibility of something that approaches ethnic cleansing to essentially get borders shaped so that only your kind of people are in those borders. This is something we've faced in many, many conflicts.
And so the U.S. pullout has basically created a vacuum of leadership and has allowed for both the Russians and the Syrians to have an upper hand in that region. Is that your assessment, Ambassador?
They were not in that region 3 weeks ago. They're in that region now because A, the Turks came in, and B, the SDF, our partner, seeing the Turks coming in, decided that they would form essentially an alliance with the Russians and the Syrians to see what kind of deal they could get from them.
Just my final question. Do you think that the SDF, it's still a peril? Do you think they're still in danger? We still have not defined, nor have we projected what's going to happen to them in the future?
One of the complications that I've had to deal with since taking this job, and had to deal with it as a foreign policy writer when I was outside of government, was we never did have a long-term answer to that, other than a political process that they and everybody else in Syria would become a part of. That is, we did not have an agenda. We neither said we will protect you militarily, nor did we say we will endorse your particular vision, which, as they told us, was an autonomous region in that area that we had seen on the map that was yellow up there a little bit earlier. We did not take a position as a government on either of those. Well, we took a position not to provide military force to support them, and we against the Turks, and we did not take a position on the long-term solution to their political issues within Syria or Syria as a whole, other than it has to be a democratic process run by the Syrian people, which is the UN resolution that's relevant here.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Mrs. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witnesses for being here again today. I am, along with so many of my colleagues, deeply grieved by Turkey's outrageous offensive against the Kurds in northeast Syria. I remain worried about the consequences and the long-term effect of Turkey's actions will have on our national security and our Kurdish allies who made immense sacrifices to defeat the Islamic State. Our top priorities must be to contain ISIS so terrorists cannot regroup, to prevent a genocide of the Kurds, and conduct a safe repositioning to ensure stability in the region. I do not want our troops to be in Syria indefinitely, but we must act wisely, consult with diplomats and certainly defense officials, and ensure that we are not creating a bigger mess for ourselves and others in the region in the future. Ambassador Jeffrey, Turkey wants to clear Kurdish People's Protection Units, or YPG, fighters from a swath of land nearly, supposedly 20 miles deep and 270 miles long. The YPG leads the pro-democracy Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which have been the heart of the fight against Syria's brutal dictator, Bashar al-Assad. Ambassador Jeffrey, how will the evacuation of Kurdish forces from Turkey's so-called safe zone affect the SDF? And is the U.S. continuing to cooperate with SDF forces, and in what capacity?
First of all, the SDF generally was not fighting the Assad regime, but rather it was focused on fighting Daesh, which was more than a handful. At times there were engagements, firefights between the two, but that wasn't their primary responsibility. In terms of the withdrawal from the zone, there has been, for a good number of years, no real strong ISIS presence in that area. Manbij, where, according to the Russian-Turkish agreement, the YPG is also to be withdrawn. Again, I have big questions as to whether that will happen. But if it did happen, I would be worried about Manbij because there are some ISIS elements there. Where most of the ISIS elements are, south of that reservoir, along as you're looking at it, the Euphrates down to the Iraqi border, that is where the SDF has most of its forces and where we still have our own people. As I said, we're executing a deliberate and strong withdrawal, but we're doing this in a way that allows us to consider Should we keep some troops on? Should we
So
keep
cooperation is still ongoing.
And the
between
cooperation is still ongoing as we work our way through what the longer-term situation will be.
And I know that we've touched on this a bit with previous questioners, but hours before the U.S. brokered ceasefire expired, we know now that Turkish President Erdogan held talks with Vladimir Putin. Ambassador Jeffrey, what do we know about the content and outcome of the talks, and how are we engaging with Turkey to prevent Russia from increasing and improving its long-term operating ability in Syria?
The agreement calls for Russian military police and Syrian, that is Assad's border police, to move into those areas along that strip that you described to the east and west of where we worked the ceasefire deal with the Turks, the central 130 kilometers, to supposedly negotiate a withdrawal of the YPG, not a military action, but a withdrawal of the YPG, and then to allow joint Turkish-Russian patrols 10 kilometers deep. This is somewhat similar to what we negotiated with the Turks back in August that they then basically reneged on when they launched their offensive. Frankly, our deal was a better deal for the Turks than the Russian one is, and so I'm very cynical about, or skeptical rather, about what the Turks are going to get out of this deal.
And so we do believe that this agreement, so to speak, has done more to increase Russia's long-term ability to operate in Syria. Would that be a fair assessment?
Anything that allows Russian forces or Assad to move into other areas is a problem for us in trying to find a decent and democratic solution to the overall Syrian crisis.
Thank you. We thank you both for your service, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I am so deeply distressed about this situation, first and foremost for our allies, the Kurds, and for the Syrian people, but equally so for our troops who have essentially had to endure the humiliation of abandoning their friends and their comrades and then being pelted with rocks and bottles as they left. It literally makes me cry to imagine. My family has a long history of military service. My father was a career Air Force pilot. I lost an uncle in Vietnam. Multiple other family members have served. And just the thought of those troops who have served this country being put in that position of what, as I said, is literally humiliation is just so wrong. And I do put this squarely at the feet of the administration in terms of its actions. I want to ask you this, Ambassador Jeffrey. In your testimony, you noted that President Trump told President Erdogan that U.S. armed forces would not support or be involved in a Turkish operation in northern Syria, and that the United States does not endorse such actions, but that we would not put U.S. forces in harm's way. Is there any reason to think that if the United States had maintained its military presence in Syria, if we had not abruptly withdrawn forces from the region, that Turkey would still have felt emboldened to launch military operations there?
That's a very good question because it allows me to come at this from a different direction. The Turkish troops crossed over the border before the president went public with the withdrawal of all of our forces from northeast Syria. That was something that he was in the process of thinking through. He'd been in the process of thinking through that since the spring of 2018, and that precipitated the withdrawal. The Turks didn't base going across on either the withdrawal of those two small outposts, which were in the area, or the decision to withdraw the forces from all of northeast Syria almost all of whom were nowhere near where the Turks were. In fact, what we did in response to your colleague's question was we gave the Turks the coordinates of where all of our forces were, and the Turks very carefully avoided.
All right, so let me, I'm gonna reclaim my time here, because then that leads me to this question. If it was an ongoing process that the administration was so aware of, why then did our closest allies not get consulted about this decision? Alarmingly, President Macron of France has publicly said that he found out about the decision on Twitter, and the UK government reportedly wasn't consulted about the decision either. And my question to you is, if we don't consult our closest allies on decisions that directly affect their troops as well, how do we expect them to trust us in the future?
It's a good point. It's basic diplomatic hygiene to consult with allies. We didn't do that in this case. Frankly, this isn't the only case. This isn't, and not with this administration, but in every administration I've been with, it's something that our allies criticize us for fairly frequently, unfortunately, and it's not a good thing.
Well, were there any foreign leaders that were consulted as part of President Trump's process in making the decision to withdraw U.S. forces? Any foreign leaders at all, other than Erdogan?
Oh, absolutely, because, and I think, Congresswoman, you put your finger on it when you use the word process. It is not only okay, it's necessary on something like this to look at the decision, why it was made, whether it was a good thing. But I can assure you this wasn't one that the President had never thought about it and then suddenly on the 6th of October said, oh, troops, Syria, get them out. This is something that had been one of the major debates within the administration that the President had talked about at various levels and with other foreign leaders, and they had talked about with him, including replacing American troops with coalition troops from France and other places.
But talking about it as some future thing and actually doing it without consulting with those foreign leaders, or at least advising them in advance so they don't learn about it on Twitter, is really, really bad for diplomatic relationships with our allies, isn't it? We can agree on that?
Absolutely, and I just conceded that point 2 minutes ago. What I'm trying to say is the President had the benefit of the views of Macron, of the various prime ministers from the UK and other countries in the back and forth for the 18 months before we pulled out.
All the more reason, if they had been involved in an ongoing discussion, that they should have been told and not learned of this on Twitter, right?
I'm agreeing with you for the third time.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's just start with the title of this hearing. I don't know what snide staffer put the title on it, but it says Betrayal of Our Syrian Kurdish Partners. And I think it requires a little bit of self-reflection because we all have our lanes. Military has their lane, state has their lane, Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives has their lane. So let's talk about that word betrayal and say, in my opinion, betrayal is to our service members, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Coast Guard, who, what do? They volunteer heroically to stand in front of all threats to our nation and anybody in our nation, as my colleague Adam spoke about so eloquently earlier. But in my opinion, the betrayal is that they are not told the totality of their mission. When was the last time that our service members were given the totality of their mission? The betrayal is to send our troops off with marching orders, but with no final destination for those marching orders, or to give them a mission that never reaches mission accomplished. So when, I'll ask this question rhetorically, but more specifically in a little bit, when was the last time that this body authorized or authored an AUMF? That is the lane, that is one of the lanes of this committee. When's the last time we did this? I'm not talking about what goes on in the NDAA and going out there and talking about, different things that we might do through DOT. When's the last time this body went out there and undertook those actions? When has this body, speaking about support for the Kurds, expressed its sense of support for an independent Kurdish state? if that's something you support. Something that I wholeheartedly support that I would love to see. When was the last time that this body or your staffs went to work to actually write an AUMF, even though it may not have gone through? When were the last times these things occurred? When did this body author the left and right limits to what our engagement should be in Syria? When did that occur? When did we go out there and do this? And so since the withdrawal, or even prior to the announcement of this withdrawal, who here has gone out there and proposed some sort of AUMF for any action against Turkey if our troops come in conflict, should one of our soldiers be attacked by somebody from Turkey? When did that occur? In this body, in our lane, outlining that authority, not, as I said, not just to provide assistance or to counter ISIS. When did that occur? So my point here in all of this is this. If you want to support continued action in Syria, absolutely go out there and make your case for what it is that you want to see. But task your staffs, use your own efforts to go out there and author those left and right limits. Give them their marching orders. Let them know where we reach mission accomplished. Author those things, take the time to do what is absolutely in our lane as members of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So if you don't want to betray our service members, who we should have no greater commitment to, then have the stones to specifically outline when we reach mission accomplished. And if you're worried about the signals that might be sent, then send a clear signal from Congress about exactly what it is that we authorize against Turkey and Erdogan, or against Assad, not just through state, but specifically militarily. And so my one question that I have is this, it is not to any of you, Mr. Chairman, will this body, as some people have expressed support for doing, it hasn't occurred on either side of the aisle, this knife cuts both ways, will this body work toward an AUMF?
Mr. Mast, I think that Congress, frankly, has been negligent in its time for several years under administrations, both Democratic and Republican. I think it's the AUMF, which is now being used as a catch-all to basically give any administration any power that they want to do anything they want militarily, is something that needs to go by the wayside. And I would hope that the Congress, it wasn't done when Republicans were in the majority, and it hasn't been done since Democrats were in the majority, because quite frankly, you know as well as I do, it's very difficult to get consensus to find that middle that everybody.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to reclaim and just ask it again. I do want to give you time to answer. I respect you. Will we in this committee work to authorize, work toward an AUMF? I agree with you. That knife cuts both
Mr.
ways,
Mast, if you
Republicans and Democrats.
If you would like to work with us on an AUMF, I'd be delighted to work with you.
100%, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
I yield back.
Mr. Sherman.
I'd like to chime in on Mr. Mast's comments, and obviously his patriotism is demonstrated to us every day. We passed an AUMF that authorized going after al-Qaeda. ISIS is an offshoot of al-Qaeda. My colleague, Mr. Schiff, has written an editorial saying that AUMF doesn't apply, and I've written one saying that it does. But I, for one, would not vote for an AUMF saying America should go to war with Turkey over the control of a 30-kilometer strip across Syria. The president came to this country and said we were voluntarily withdrawing because that was his philosophical belief. What may have actually happened is the Turks threatened us with war, and we blinked. And rather than tell the American people the truth, which is, as powerful as we are not going to go to war against Turkey for this strip of land. As loyal as we are to the Kurds, you're not that loyal. Instead, he packages it as if this is some great machismo exercise in withdrawal. On October 11th, 2019, Turkey launched multiple artillery rounds near the U.S. base in Syria, effectively bracketing the base. Ambassador Jeffrey, if we had left our troops there, would Turkey have been willing to kill them to achieve its goals?
Absolutely not. And Turkey never thought that those, as again, the troops we're talking about, in the area that the Turks were even contemplating moving into, were three, roughly 12-soldier outposts along the Turkish border. The Turks were never considered these to be a threat. They never thought that they had to get the America to withdraw them. It just wasn't a calculation. All they wanted to do was to know their the grid coordinates for those and any other.
So you're saying if we had left our troops there, Turkey still would have displaced the Kurds from this strip. They just would have bypassed our forces?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we did have
and then,
bypass
so our forces wouldn't have helped the Kurds under that scenario. Turkey would achieve its objectives, and but at least we wouldn't have withdrawn. Is there any is there any explanation as to why American troops are withdrawing south of the 30-kilometer strip?
The president was faced with obviously a very fluid situation. As with every president that I've worked with, the first concern is force protection. A large part of our overall force was either just to the east or just to the west of the Euphrates and the Kobani-Manbij area, and that was going to be cut off by Turkish forces, the road leading to Iraq, Turkish forces, Turkish-supported and very ill-disciplined opposition militias, ISIS elements possibly.
I need to go on to another question. We didn't break Syria. We did massively reduce the amount of chemical weapons that would be used in that conflict. Even so, even though we didn't break it, someday we will be called upon to help fix it. Should the U.S. condition American rebuilding assistance on removal of Iranian military and Iranian proxy military from Syria?
That is one, but not the only condition for us providing any stabilization assistance.
Came here 23 years ago. One of the things I thought was morally incumbent upon Congress was to recognize the first genocide of the 20th century, the Armenian genocide. We were told, but Turkey's a great ally of the United States. Don't put that at risk. How's that working out for us?
If I may, Ambassador.
Mr. Palmer.
Yes. Thank you for that question, Congressman.
Does the dishonoring of America and the undercutting of our reputation for speaking the truth, was that worth it? Did we get some great help, alliance, love, and loyalty from Erdogan?
Congressman, I don't think that was ever the calculus. And I do appreciate what you're saying about the talk about the,
yes. I mean, the historical facts are clear. We chose not to formally recognize them because many thought that Turkey would behave well if we didn't. How's that working out?
Let me, if I may, Congressman, begin by underscoring our view that the massacre of 1.5 million Armenians in 1915 was one of the great crimes of the 20th century, and that is not in dispute. When we look at the relationship with Turkey, I am reluctant to attach the word great to that relationship, but it certainly is consequential. And I think what it is that you've heard from administration after administration.
Well, our relationship with Hong Kong is consequential. We don't fear to pass, just 2 weeks ago, 3 measures that Beijing really hated.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Just in context of the question you asked, I'm wondering how much the relationship has changed between Turkey and the European Union when years ago they went on record of recognizing the Armenian genocide.
The relationship between Turkey and the European Union is fraught and complicated. Turkey...
And so is ours.
That is correct, Congressman, yes.
Okay.
I would point out that immediately after recognizing the genocide in the next several years, French exports to Turkey tripled, in spite of the fact that the one consequence Ankara said France would face was a diminution in such exports. So we have cowered, we have dishonored ourselves in front of a paper tiger that the French had the courage to confront, and we have achieved nothing in terms of being able to call Turkey a great ally. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Watkins.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. I attempt to approach these dealings emotionlessly, but it's tough. I was embedded with the Turkish Peshmerga in Iraq for many years, and have so much respect for the challenges they face. Peshmerga, of course, means those who face death, and they do. And helping to train them, working with them, is something that I carry with me during these dealings. So I know that Iraq is not center mass on the conversations today. Do you have any comments on the Peshmerga and as they kind of act as a divide between Syria, Iran, and others? Do you have any comments in that regard?
Well, I've also worked with their political leadership since the late 1990s, very extensively, including 3 years in Iraq.
But the Barzanis?
Yes.
Or Talibanis?
All of them.
All of them.
And we have the utmost respect for them. They have found first of all, they're at peace. Their economy is in pretty good shape. They took in hundreds and hundreds of thousands of refugees from ISIS, and they treated them well. They have a good relationship with Turkey. They are a constituent part of the Iraqi body politic. It is a good news story, in part because they were able to defend themselves effectively with our help, Congressman.
Thanks. The President just held a press conference, and he announced permanent ceasefire and the end of sanctions. Now, even in the press conference, he admitted that permanent is a strong word to use. I want you to just comment on the confidence that you have in ending sanctions and the confidence you might have in a permanent ceasefire.
I'm chuckling about the word permanent because we looked at this statement and said, I actually said it's okay because it wasn't in the agreement with the Turks, but it does describe the way the Turks presented their decision to stop Operation Peace Spring last night to us, so it's okay. It's as permanent as anything else, and we differentiate that between the 5-day pause that we had before with the ceasefire. I mean, we're using all these semantic words because that's what you have to do in diplomacy, but in the language of normal people, it's a relatively permanent ceasefire. And in terms of the executive order, we have lifted those sanctions that were imposed on the 17th of October, but the executive order that was passed that day remains in effect, and that executive order is aimed at anybody who challenges the peace, stability, security, or the territorial integrity of Syria or the political process to try to find an outcome of the civil war. That is a very, very powerful administration tool, and this administration is ready to use it again, be it against Turkey, be it against others, if they violate the provisions of the executive order. So we're happy we have it.
That's great. And I just want to say again how much I hold the Kurdish people in such a high regard. It's very personal to me as a veteran and as a prior defense contractor who worked in Kurdistan, the Kurdish northern region of Iraq. I lived in Erbil for stretches of time in my career, and many of us are dedicated to doing everything we can to support the Kurdish people. So thank you for being here. I appreciate your time and your insight. I yield back.
Gentleman, yield back. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, for 5
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey and Mr. Palmer, for being here and for your public service. None of what I say or my questions are meant to impugn you. I understand you're simply trying to do the best given Donald Trump's disastrous decision in Syria. I don't oppose withdrawing troops from Syria. I oppose how it was done because of the impulsive decision of the president with no planning and coordination has resulted in some ISIS terrorists being set free, in Turkish forces slaughtering our allies, the Kurds, and it's emboldened Iran and Russia. Last week, Donald Trump tweeted that one reason he did this, in fact, the primary reason, is to, quote, basically bring, quote, our great soldiers and military home, unquote. Our troops in Syria actually didn't go home. They went to Western Iraq. Isn't that correct?
That's still under consideration, Congressman. That is, in terms of the withdrawal, the ones who came out by road obviously went to Western Iraq. There was no place else to go. And what their status will be, whether they will, some of them will stay in Iraq, some of them will go home, some of them may be used in other areas. Right now, Secretary Esper is working that with the Iraqi authorities.
Some might also stay in Syria, isn't that correct?
Well, first of all, we will have some great soldiers remaining in Al-Tanf to the south, and that's very fortunate from my standpoint of the overall political process. And people are reviewing, as I mentioned earlier, at the highest levels of the government, exactly how we're going to do this withdrawal and if there's going to be any residual force. You'll remember last time when the President announced a withdrawal in December of 2018, in February 2019, he said, I'm going to still keep a residual force. So that discussion is back and forth. I don't know what he will finally decide, but it's a very actively debated issue right now.
Thank you. So we were given images of Russian forces taking over at least one U.S. military facility. Is that true?
That is true.
Okay. There was also public reporting that the U.S. military had to bomb some of our own facilities, such as a weapons depot, to prevent it from getting into enemy hands. Is that true?
That is true.
Okay. I just want to say both those incidents are an embarrassment to the United States. I served in active duty in the United States military. I never thought that would happen. All right, so I'd like to talk a little bit now about the President's conflicts of interest in Turkey. I have an article I'd like to submit for the record from the Daily Beast. This is dated April 13th, 2017. The title of it is Donald Trump's Huge Conflict of Interest in Turkey. It talks about 2 Trump towers in Turkey receiving between $1 and $5 million since the beginning of 2015. So if we could put that in the record, Mr. Chair.
Without objection.
Yeah. Do you know if Donald Trump's business interest in Turkey was a factor in his decision to withdraw troops from Syria?
I am sure that that was not part of the decision train.
How do you know it wasn't part of his decision-making?
I'm basically sure, as far as I can say.
On what basis do you have?
On the basis of having been involved, not with the President himself, but with his top advisors on all of the pros and cons of this question of keeping troops on for the last since I've had the job 14 months.
You weren't on that phone call with the President of Turkey, were you?
No, I wasn't.
You don't know what was said in that phone call?
I have a pretty good idea.
Do you know if any business interests were discussed?
I did not hear of any business interests being discussed.
And you don't know the President's, what's going on in his mind, right? You have no way of knowing if business interests had a factor in this at all, do you?
No, but as a government official, I can just explain to you as best I can how.
Well, let me ask you, do you think any business interests factor into the President's initial decision to have the G7 at Doral?
Once again, in terms of the decisions on Syria, I cannot say anything about any business decision ever coming up. I have never heard of one. I have never heard even the slightest rumor of one within the administration.
But you don't know. Were you informed of this decision to withdraw from Syria before the President did it impulsively after that phone call? Was there any prior coordination? You were surprised, weren't you, by what happened?
We were informed and consulted on the President's weighing of the options to withdraw forces almost daily for 18 months before this decision was taken.
So let me just say this. It should never happen that American people and members of Congress even have to ask that question. And you have no way of knowing, sir. I respectfully yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Burchett, the gentleman from Tennessee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Sir, how do we ensure that the situation on the border between northeast Syria and Turkey is not abused by Iran to expand its presence in the country and solidify a land bridge between Tehran and Beirut?
That is one of our concerns, Congressman. It's one reason why the President decided to keep U.S. forces on the ground in Al-Tanf, which is a stride, in part, because that's the reason they're there, to continue the operations against ISIS, but it also sits astride the main east-west road between Tehran and Beirut. So that's the first thing we'll do. Secondly, we are working very closely with the Turks on this ceasefire that has just been announced by the White House and that we negotiated now 6 days ago. While we don't deal with the regime, we do deal with the Russians, as I said earlier, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully in Syria, but we have a very extensive both military and a military deconfliction, because that's the only word they can use, and political exchange on Syrian issues. And finally, we have every intention, if things work out, to continue our relationship with the SDF, which still controls much of the terrain in the northeast.
All right. When you look at everything Turkey has been up to recently, like the S-400 purchases from Russia, Halkbank helping Iran evading sanctions and firing on our troops, just to name a few, can we even trust or rely on Turkey as an ally now?
The relationship between the United States and Turkey is complicated and multidimensional, Congressman, and we are going through a particularly difficult patch right now. You've identified some of the key challenges in that relationship. Our goal is to work through this problem set, come out the other side in a position that is stronger, that is more stable, that is more productive and positive than it is currently, and we are committed to working through all of those issues and building over time to strengthen and improve the quality of the U.S.-Turkey alliance.
All right. Without our U.S. troops in northeast Syria, does anyone have the capacity to make sure that ISIS does not resurface?
Again, as I tried to say earlier, I can't convince this body or any other body that we had troops there for no reason. We obviously had troops there for a mission. The mission was defeating ISIS, so if you remove those troops before that mission is complete, then you have a problem. And we do have a problem right now. We're working our way through it. We're looking at various options of how we will maintain a relationship with the SDF, what kind of military coalition, because we're one of 80 nations, and organizations, what kind of coalition presence, if any, will be in the Northeast, how we can do this by other means. But of course, it would be nonsensical for me to tell you all that it makes no difference whether we had troops there now when we had troops there 3 weeks ago risking their lives to carry out a mission. So, of course, by taking those troops out before that mission is completely and decisively done means that we have to deal with the consequences of that, and we are doing that right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Phillips, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have to start by saying that I share my colleagues' grave concerns, dismay, disgust, and even heartbreak over our country's recent actions. The world notices how we treat our allies, and I believe that we have compromised our ability to affect our foreign policy over the years to come because of it. We've heard from a lot of people in my district, a lot of warriors. One of them wrote, quote, "At the core of this issue are our American values: trust, commitment, sanctity of human life, human dignity. When we make commitments, especially when we make them with the vulnerable, with the promise that we will prevent harm, we should keep those commitments." End quote. I'm afraid this is an example that will be used at West Point and war colleges. I know you're a graduate, Mr. Palmer, across the country as an example of how not to conduct ethical and strategic decision-making. With that in mind, Ambassador Jeffrey, in your opening remarks and your testimony, you shared our strategy, our foreign policy towards Syria. Do you believe that what you shared in your testimony is congruent with the actions of President Trump in recent weeks?
Considering the fact that President Trump a few minutes ago announced that we would be keeping some troops on in northeast Syria, it's a bit more congruent now than it was a few minutes ago.
Okay, so it was incongruent until a few minutes ago.
I actually didn't say that. I said it's even more congruent now.
Oh, even more congruent now. Mr. Palmer, how do you feel? Congruent or incongruent?
I'm going to go with congruent, Congressman.
Interesting. Do you believe, this question back to both of you, do you believe our country, the United States of America, is better off now than we were 3 weeks ago?
Again, I don't want to leave the impression here as a representative of the administration, nor does the administration, that we did not think that Turkey's coming across the border on the 8th, 9th of October was anything other than a tragic disaster for the situation in northeast Syria. That is why this administration, beginning with the President, immediately wrote a letter to President Erdogan, passing on our leader of the SDF, General Mazloum's request for a ceasefire and political talks. That is why the President then had a conversation with, or he passed on a message to President Erdogan that I delivered a couple of days later, and then dispatched the Vice President, the National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of State all out to, I won't say impose, but to demand a ceasefire, along with very strong sanctions that we immediately rolled out right after the incursion began. So, yeah, this was a bad thing, and we took very energetic efforts to try to contain it, and to the extent we can, roll it back.
Sir, with all due respect, I concur it was a disaster, but it's hard to say it was an unanticipated disaster. Would you say so?
It was always, as the President said, long-planned Turkish incursion. The Turks always had that option. We did not have a military option. We took the decision not to have a military option, and I absolutely think that was the correct decision. But we did have a policy decision to use every means short of the military to deter the Turks, to convince the Turks not to come in. And we thought that we had succeeded. We had done a deal with them where we were doing joint patrols, joint aviation missions over the Northeast. We believe and we know that met their security concerns. So they then took a decision to come in on their own.
So you're testifying that we used every tool in our toolbox to the best of our abilities to prevent what we're seeing happen right now?
Everyone but military, and also we did not succeed.
Okay. My last question is relative to Turkey's endgame under Erdogan. I'd love both of your perspectives on what you believe their long-term strategy is in the region, especially absent our participation.
In Syria, it is to ensure, and it's relatively congruent to use that word with ours, other than the problem with the Northeast, it is basically to put pressure on the Assad regime, because Turkey sees the Assad regime as a threat to them, to limit to the extent they can Russia's influence, and to deter Iran operating to the south of Turkey. So these are all, as I said, congruent with our interests.
More broadly, Congressman, Turkey's goals are to play a leadership role in the region and to ensure Turkish security, including in particular through the comprehensive defeat of the PKK.
All right, my time is up and I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Allred, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Engel and Mr. McCall, our ranking member, for holding this hearing. Ambassador Jeffrey, I want to thank you for your distinguished service in both Democratic and Republican administrations, and also to extend the same thing to you, Mr. Palmer. I don't envy you, though, for having to be here today, defending what I consider to be the indefensible. This administration has brought this committee and this House together on a bipartisan way in a fashion that few issues have. Last week, we, of course, voted overwhelmingly to disapprove of these actions, and my colleagues have been ably laying out how disastrous this decision has been. But I want to talk about the U.S. strategic objectives and national security interests that you talk about in your joint statement. In your written testimony, you note that the U.S.'s strategic objectives and national security interests in Syria remain, 1, the enduring defeat of ISIS and al-Qaeda, and their affiliates in Syria. 2, the reduction and expulsion of Iranian malign influence. And 3, resolution of the Syrian civil war on terms that are favorable to the United States and our allies. I want to ask you through each of these, 1, 2, and 3, beginning with the enduring defeat of ISIS and al-Qaeda, whether or not this action has furthered that strategic national security interest for us.
Congressman, first of all, it's not a difficult task. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to serve my country. It's an honor to serve this administration, which I think overall is doing its very best to secure America throughout the world. We're talking about a situation that has not turned out well for us in the past few weeks and how we're working our way through it. But I'm delighted to be here sharing my views and the administration's views with you and getting your views back. In terms of all three, the one that's hit the hardest by what has happened, of course, is the defeat ISIS, because that was the purpose of our forces in the Northeast. But again, the President's decision to keep forces on, and he talked to General Mazloum this morning. General Mazloum has just tweeted that he thanks the President for his tireless efforts that stopped the brutal Turkish attack and expressed willingness to continue working with us. So, boy, do we have a complex situation. It was pretty easy before. We had us, the SDF, and ISIS on the run in the Northeast. Now we have still all three of those and about 6 more actors. How we're going to sort our way through this, I'll get to work as soon as I leave here.
Yeah, well, I want to comment on that. I saw the statement from the General. I think that when someone relies on us for their existence, and we allow them to be attacked by an ally, and then we stop the attack, them thanking us for that action probably doesn't ring as true. I think we saw with the throwing of objects at our troops when they were trying to pull out by some of the Kurds, how they feel about it. But let me ask another follow-up question on that, because according to multiple U.S. defense and military officials, counter-ISIS operations have essentially stopped because SDF forces have reoriented to confront the Turkish invasion. Do you think that's going to they're going to re-engage now with this ceasefire? What is our approach there to work with them, and what are the prospects of that work?
Much of the SDF forces remained along the Euphrates, where the remaining ISIS threat is, along with most of our frontline advisory teams, and that is still continuing. New operations and such, whenever you get a dramatic shift in a military situation in an area of operations, believe me, nobody's got the time to do new operations, but typically people have standing orders to continue doing what they're doing, and that's what happened. The fighting with the Turks was over so quickly, it stopped now 6 days ago, that a lot of the forces that were not basically pulled to the north. And right now we're seeing what will happen to the forces that are in the areas in the Northeast. In the Northeast, there was very little action against ISIS because there were no ISIS forces to speak of there.
Okay. So is it your assessment?
In that strip along the Northeast, of course, they were further south.
All right, so is it your assessment that this will, what is your assessment, I should say, about how this will impact ISIS's ability to reconstitute?
First of all, 99% of the ISIS detainees are still detained as I speak. Some 100 plus were able to escape, and we're watching that closely. Secondly, based upon how we work with the SDF, I just gave you the statement that was encouraging from General Mazloum. I reiterated the President's commitment to keep some forces on. If we do that and if we maintain air, I believe very strongly that we can continue an effective de-ISIS campaign, and we can continue to pursue the other 2 goals that you asked, whether they were impacted as well.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. I now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, both of you, for coming in. And Ambassador Jeffrey, it's good to see you again. I'm going to ask you some questions. I want to know if it's correct that, in your estimation, that Turkey's President Erdogan wants to expand Turkish control over a section of northern Syria.
Absolutely not. As I said yesterday in the Senate, I differentiate between Turkey and Iran. Turkey is not an expansionist country. Turkey.
So they're not trying to go into this section of that's been delineated, and we all see it in all the where they want to control and move people out of it?
Turkey is trying to ensure that it doesn't face a long-term threat from the PKK in northeastern Syria analogous to what it faces.
Northeastern Syria, that's in another country than Turkey.
Right, just like the threat it faces out of northern Iraq, just like the threat that Israel faces from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. That's the Turkish motivation. It isn't to take territory.
Well, so is it fair to say that the goal of Turkey's invasion into Syria is to remove Kurdish people, not just fighters, but Kurdish civilians from that section of Syria that he is invading, and he's using violence to force them out of that geographic area? Military force, arms, violence.
One, we have written commitments from the Turks that they would not do that. Two, given that there's somewhere between 15 and 20% of the Turkish population is Kurdish, and many of them serve and fight in the Turkish army, I wouldn't assume automatically that they're out to do ethnic cleansing. What they're out to do is to get what they believe are elements linked to the PKK out of that area.
Let me, reclaiming my time, I just want to talk about the meaning of this. I know you wanted to have like a maximalist definition of ethnic cleansing as if it's sort of a genocide on a national scale. But in the 90s, we started using this term to talk about the conflict in Yugoslavia, at that, what was then Yugoslavia. And the United Nations explained ethnic cleansing as, quote, a purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove by violent or terror-inspiring means the civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from certain geographic areas. And this description sounds a lot like what reporters and human rights organizations tell us has happened to the Kurdish people since the Turkish invasion. Just last week, Amnesty International reported, quote, the Turkish military offensive into northeast Syria has wreaked havoc on the lives of Syrian civilians who once again have been forced to flee their homes and are living in constant fear of indiscriminate bombardment, abductions, and summary killings. Based on what's been reported and what you've said, it seems like it would be accurate to call the Turkish assault on Kurdish people in that area of northern Syria an act of ethnic cleansing, as far as I'm concerned. And here's how President Trump described the Turkish invasion on Thursday. So you have a 22-mile strip. And for many, many years, Turkey, in all fairness, they've had a legitimate problem with it. They had terrorists. They had a lot of people in there they couldn't have. They've suffered a lot of loss of lives also. And they had to have it cleaned out. Does the president support the ethnic cleansing of Kurdish people from that part of Syria?
Absolutely not. He sent us out to negotiate a document I have in my hands, which has 3 of the 13 paragraphs deal directly with this.
Okay, so if the president literally used the words cleaned out to describe what Turkey is doing to the Kurds, Mr. Ambassador, and suggested it was justifiable, and said in all fairness, quote unquote, Turkey had a legitimate problem with this area of Syria, and he called their gripe legitimate, has he not approved of Turkey's actions? De facto, sir.
He's trying to explain to the American people why a NATO ally took that action, not approving that action, not green-lighting that action, but explaining the reasons why. It was not to clear out the area of the population, most of which, where the Turks are, by the way, are Arab, not Kurd, but rather to clear out the people who were associated with the PKK. We thought that was not a wise decision. We thought there were other ways to do it, but Turkey has legitimate security concerns, and we've said that publicly 1,000 times.
Thank you. Sir, I really appreciate the job you're doing. You're doing a good job, but I have to say that last week, the President of the United States gave a thumbs up to an act of ethnic cleansing. And he can try to tell us otherwise, and his representatives can, but his words are clear, and history will be clear about the reality of what's happening there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Spanberger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. To the witnesses, Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to begin with you. 3 weeks ago, I went on a bipartisan congressional delegation trip to Turkey, Afghanistan, and the Syrian-Jordanian border, during which time I met with representatives of foreign governments, U.S. military, intelligence, and diplomatic leadership. And over the course of those conversations, I was repeatedly told of the danger posed to the United States and our allies if Turkish forces moved into northeast Syria, which was an area protected by our Kurdish partners, the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF. When we arrived home, we realized through news alerts that, in fact, we had, the United States, through the president's tweet, had green-lighted Turkish entry into that same area. For years now, the SDF has been our staunch allies in the fight against ISIS, losing by estimates, and I heard you quote the number as well, more than 10,000 of their own soldiers in this process. And more recently, they have been the first line of defense in maintaining the gains that we've made. At the beginning of your testimony, I heard you say that we had 3 goals in Syria. First, enduring defeat of ISIS. Second, political solution in Syria. And third, the removal of Iranian forces. Did the effort, our greenlighting, or in any way, however we want to term it, the United States' stance to greenlight Turkish forces to go into Syria, does that in fact impact in a positive way the enduring defeat of ISIS?
One, the Turkish incursion into northeast Syria has not been positive for the fight against ISIS, obviously in a dozen different ways. However, we never greenlighted this. And I have to keep coming back to this point because it keeps on coming up. Nobody told, the Turks weren't waiting to get permission from us.
So then let me ask this. The removal and the announcement that we would remove U.S. forces from this area of Syria, does that help towards the goal of enduring defeat of ISIS?
If we're talking about the removal of all forces from northeast Syria, it was the considered opinion of most people in the administration that that's not going to contribute to the defeat of ISIS, enduring defeat of ISIS, and that's one reason why the President this morning essentially made an adjustment, I'm using my words carefully here, adjustment to his decision to withdraw all forces. He's going to leave some forces on.
So then the second goal, which would be the political solution in Syria, we've now created a circumstance in which our allies in the fight against ISIS, the SDF has now turned its attention towards Assad, entered into an agreement with Assad, thereby de facto entering into positive relations with Russia. Has this been helpful towards the American goals of what would be a political outcome in Syria?
It's a good question. We're looking into that. The SDF has long had relations with Russia and the Assad government. We also did not tell them they couldn't because we don't control the political future of that group or any other group inside Syria other than what we're allowed to do under the relevant UN resolution. So they were talking for a long time with them. We have to see what this agreement will actually, between the Russians and the Turks, will actually turn out on the ground.
But departing and leaving our previous allies to their own defenses, and as my colleague from Michigan said, potentially as the potential victims of genocide in northeast Syria, does that lay the groundwork for a political solution in Syria that would be in keeping with American national security interests?
Yeah. Again, we gave political guarantees to the Kurds that we would use all necessary means, all political means other than military force to try to keep the Turks out and try to keep their situation stable against Turkey. The Turks decided not to heed us, not to essentially accept our sticks and go in.
So, and have our efforts in any way been helpful towards the removal of Iranian forces from Syria?
I think our overall effort in Syria has been placing pressure on Iran in many ways, some of which I can't discuss here, but they're fairly significant. How this will have an impact on it, I don't know. But again, importantly, we're keeping our forces on in Al-Tanf in the south.
So, and my concern, I'm a former case officer with the CIA, so my perspective is one of human intelligence. I think it's notable that as a consumer of intelligence that might be driving some of our policy, I think it should be deeply concerning to you and your colleagues that we have now lost access to human intelligence through the relationships that we did have with the Kurds. My final question is, we've now, we were withdrawing all of our troops, then we were withdrawing some of our troops. The president has now said we're going to leave some of the troops in Syria in order to keep the peace. The frenetic nature of this foreign policy objectives or strategy, I suppose one would call it, is it in any way going to serve the goals, those 1, 2, 3 goals that we stated, to remove troops, then not remove troops, and go back and forth, betray our allies in the process?
The gentlelady's time has expired, but the witness would please answer the question.
I wouldn't use the word frenetic, but a rapidly changing set of circumstances obviously poses challenges to us. We'll be able to handle them.
Certainly rapidly changing, I understand, but when we buoy back and forth, that seems a little bit more frenetic than rapidly changing. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to both of you guys for coming. I'm going to kind of follow on, piggyback on some of Ms. Spanberger's questions, because I also was on the bipartisan trip that went over to Jordan, to Afghanistan, as well as to Turkey, to a person when we met with people, either state or military or the allies that we had. When we did ask that question of what keeps you up at night, kind of what scenario most concerns you, many people responded with the incursion of Turkey into Syria, and we literally landed on the ground at about 6 a.m. on Monday to the news that we had made that decision, that our president had made that decision. I guess my question have to do with the decision processes, because, sir, in your testimony, you talked a little bit about the fact that you have daily conversations with Mr. Pompeo. You said that, in quote, I'm trying to make sure that I get this right, so that you have obsessive reviews and discussions about this situation. Do those reviews and obsessive discussions also include some of the State Department people whom we might have met with in the region? Do they also include some of the military people whom we might have met with in the region who had as many as 4 stars on them on there, and could not possibly have been that good of actors that they would not have belied that this was coming?
I personally review up to 300 emails and telegrams and telephone conversations a day with those people. And what they say goes into everything I pass on to both Secretary Pompeo and my White House counterparts.
So are you saying that those folks, when we left the ground on Sunday, I believe it would be the 7th, did know that this was happening?
No, what I'm saying is that their concerns about the potentially disastrous effects of a Turkish incursion were definitely passed on to the top, and that's one reason why this administration and this Congress acted in the extremely vigorous way it did. First of all, unsuccessfully to stop the incursion, and then secondly, with sanctions, with diplomacy, and ultimately a ceasefire negotiation did stop.
So I would like to go back and just get some clarification, because when you say that there was no green light, I really do want to emphasize that it feels as though it was certainly an implicit green light, since you did mention in your testimony today that had we kept those few dozen troops there, that this would not necessarily have happened.
Oh, I'm sorry. I either misspoke or I was misunderstood. No, those forces had no bearing on any Turkish decision, to the best of my knowledge from any source of information that I have access to, and that's a lot. The Turks would have simply driven around them.
My next question has to do with what you mentioned in terms of some of the prisons and camps that are still being manned and managed by SDF. What world do we feel as though that those folks have the real focus to be able to continue to man those when they've effectively been betrayed by us?
Well, remember, they're not doing that as a favor to us, Congresswoman. They're doing that to secure their own populations and to secure their own safety. They consider these people terrorists and criminals, and as I said, they've done a really good job under fairly chaotic circumstances in keeping 99% of them under guard.
And do you believe that they'll be able to continue to stay there?
I'm more confident today than I was 6 hours ago.
My last question has to do with your conversation about war crimes. It just really struck me that when Syria was conducting what amounted to war crimes using chemical weapons, that there was a hue and outcry, from our country and from our administration about that. I haven't heard anything about that other than here, and I'm just wondering, what do we need to know other than what we already know for the American people to understand that the Turks are possibly committing war crimes as well?
Well, there was considerable both administration, public commentary, and a great deal of media focus on the two incidents, the killing of a civilian Kurdish organization woman, Hürmet Khalifa, along the main east-west road, and then in either the same or a similar incident by the same opposition group supported by the Turks, the killing of several people who were defenseless with their hands tied. We're looking into that now. We immediately reached out to Ankara and asked for the highest level explanation of this, and we're not going to give up on that. But that's the incident that we are all focusing on right now. There haven't been a lot of them. In Idlib, in contrast, when the Syrian government and its allies go in, we see dozens of these a day as a deliberate policy, not as a possible offshoot of an ill-disciplined element. We see it as deliberate policy approved from the top.
So I've run out of time, but I would definitely like to have us follow up if we could get more detail on the crimes that you believe have been committed and what it is that we're doing to respond to them. And I appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, you've heard a lot from a number of my colleagues about our decision to, as many of us have argued, to betray our Kurdish allies. And I fully agree with those concerns. I'm not really going to add much because I think they have covered it. I want to stress something that I think is perhaps even more important, and that is that this decision by the President not only cleared the way for Turkey to attack the Kurds, it has effectively cleared the way for the Assad regime and the Russians to move back into an even larger area of northeastern Syria, because, of course, the Kurds, feeling as if they could no longer depend on us for protection, turned immediately, understandably, to the devil and made a deal to assure their long-term protection with the Russians and Assad. There are about 3 million people living in this part of northeastern Syria. About 70% are Syrian Arab. Only about 25% are Kurdish. And, let's be fair here. Turkey does have some scruples. The Assad regime and the Russians do not. And so my question to you, and this has not gotten enough attention, is what is happening to civilians in areas that are being reoccupied by the regime? What is likely to happen in the large population centers of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, which are full of people who oppose the Assad regime and who will be pursued and killed if the Russians following and the regime following this deal are able to go back in there?
Yeah. I seldom am complimentary to the Russians, but the Russian military police units that are involved in this and throughout Syria tend to treat the population fairly well. But you're absolutely right. The Assad forces have a terrible reputation, and we'll watch that as closely as possible. Again, they're doing this in coordination with the SDF. The SDF, of course, have a vested interest, and a very sincere one, in making sure that their people are not harmed by the regime. So we have to see how this works out.
Yes, but the SDF is largely a Kurdish militia. Their people are not necessarily the 70% who are not Kurdish. And let me just ask you, this is real-world stuff. If the YPG is now dependent on the Russians and the regime for protection, and if the Russians and the regime say to the YPG, we will only keep you secure from the Turks if you allow the regime to basically reconstitute itself as the dominant power in northeast Syria, what on earth is the YPG going to say? They're not going to fight the regime under those circumstances.
We're looking into exactly what the circumstances are and what the relationship will be between the Russians, the regime, and the SDF after this agreement that was made in Sochi. You're absolutely correct that that could be a danger.
Well, I'm glad to hear you're looking into it, but I just saw the statement the President made, or I read the points. There was absolutely no reference to any of this. The only thing he is saying, in an effort somehow to reassure us, is we've secured the oil. We secure the oil. We secure the oil. I have not heard him say a darn thing about securing the people who live in these cities that we helped to liberate who struggled against the Assad regime. All he talks about is we secure the oil. The rest, and here again I'm quoting him, is sand, sand, sand. So can you assure me that we are going to use whatever tiny bit of influence we have left in this part of the Middle East that we have ceded to Russia to protect almost 3 million people who may now be subject to the yoke of the Assad regime?
Again, we will do everything we can, both to achieve our objectives in Syria and to maintain the well-being to the extent we can of these people. But there are limits to what we will do with military force.
Well, of course. I mean, with 200 people or however many people, we can't do very much. We were able to do something because we are aligned with the SDF, which until now had no reason to be cutting deals with the devil. Now they have cut a deal with the devil, and it's hard for me to see how 200 or 100 or 300 troops can even secure these oil fields as if that were our primary national interest, much less secure a population that is, well, they're not only human beings, but this is the population from which ISIS recruits. Isn't that correct?
To some degree, yes, but whether it's 200 or 20,000, Congressman, the key thing is what is the legal mission they have been given? If they've been given a legal mission to secure an area from everybody, that's one thing. If they've been given a legal mission, as they have been given ultimately from this body, to pursue an al-Qaeda offshoot in northeast Syria, that's a different set of authorities, and they cannot use that authority serendipitously to go after anybody and everybody.
Time is up, but with permission of the chair, I also just want to ask you about the stabilization funding. I asked you about this the last time you were here. Hundreds of millions of dollars have not been obligated, and it speaks to
the gentleman's time has expired. If you want to give a brief response.
Right. President just approved $50 million for stabilization from that, most of it from that bucket of money, and $4.5 million of additional stabilization funding for the white helmets.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Trone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your service, Assistant Secretary Palmer and Ambassador Jeffries, for being here today and all you've done for a long, long, successful career. Thank you. My complaint really is with the administration, not you, Mr. Jeffries. But it's clear that today's talking point that came out is there's no commitment to protect the Kurds. I heard that a number of times today. And I would like to point out that I believe that we have a moral commitment. We had a moral commitment. We still do. We fought together with the Kurds. Congressman Watkins himself was over there. They helped fight our war. 11,000 of the Kurds died for us. We're clearly on the same team. And the fact that there was, quote unquote, no written commitment to protect the Kurds, I don't think anybody should care. The other talking point that bothered me today was and it came up again repeatedly, there's no green light. I thought my Republican colleague, Mr. Kinzinger, pointed out quite correctly, there was a green light by the administration. I would call it a very bright green light that came from the president. He gave the green light, and now with today's announcement, the dictator in Turkey has been given everything he ever wanted. It's all his. So I'm very disappointed. The rest of the world's disappointed, and God bless you in an impossible job you've been given to justify that. Moving to a second subject. 6.2 million people have been displaced, largest internally displaced population in the world, 160-some thousand just the last 2 weeks. Turkey, NATO ally, once welcomed Syrian refugees, now is invading the neighboring country. Turkey, NATO ally, purchased Russian defensive equipment, struck a deal with the Russians on the buffer zone. Turkey, NATO ally, cooperating with Russia. As the Washington Post pointed out this morning, Russia's succeeding in accomplishing their end game. The Assad regime is regaining control of more territory. He's propping up their authority and legitimacy. Russia's taken our military bases. Hundreds of ISIS detainees have escaped. Ambassador, how is it possible any of these developments serve the interest of the United States?
The Turkish incursion and all of the things that have flown from it, and you summed them up pretty well, are really a disaster. They're tragic, and we've said this. We've said this in our executive order that we immediately rolled out. You have said it here in the Congress. Just for the record once again, and I won't even use green light, I will say this administration did not encourage or in any way indicate to the Turks that it was okay for them to come in. We told them this is a bad idea. Secondly, we did...
I don't think we told them we're not going to stand for it. Mr. Putin told the Turks that he's not going to be comfortable with them coming into northeastern Syria, but we weren't clear. We didn't man up. We didn't stand up and say, no, you can't come in there. Our advisors are there. Congressman Watkins was once there, and you can't come in. He didn't say that, and that's why they came over. That was weakness.
We didn't say we would use military force to stop them. That is true. We said we would use every other tool in our quiver to do so, or at least to try to do so, from sanctions to things like a visit to the United States.
And they didn't care, and now they have their territory, the sanctions are gone, and I'm sure he'll be over to hold hands with Mr. Trump at some point. Deputy Assistant Secretary Palmer, we've not imposed sanctions for their purchase of the S-400 missiles defense system. Now they're pushing the boundaries even more. Is this really acceptable for a NATO ally?
Absolutely not, Congressman. And I would underscore at the very beginning of this that Turkey paid a significant price for the decision to acquire the S-400 system. They've been removed from the F-35 program. We're talking both in terms of the delivery of physical aircraft and the unwinding of Turkish participation in the industrial part of F-35 production. That is a significant price that Turkey paid immediately upon acquiring the S-400 system. We opposed Turkey's acquisition of this system. We made that very clear to the Turkish authorities at the very highest levels, up to and including President Erdogan. Turkey moved forward anyway against our advice, against our admonitions, and there were costs and consequences that were imposed immediately on Turkey and on the U.S.-Turkey relationship. Looking ahead to the issue of Qaeda, that is under review. There is a deliberative process in place. It's a complex question, particularly with respect to the implementation of sanctions against a NATO ally. Secretary Pompeo has made clear that we will follow the law. We will implement Qaeda as necessary and appropriate. I can't give you a timeline on that, but I can tell you that that issue is under deliberative review.
Thank you both for your service.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, your valiant attempt to describe what this administration has done through very deliberative diplomatic efforts is in total contradiction to what the President himself said after this occurred. He said even while Pence was on his way over there to do something, give away the store, I think, that there's just a lot of sand over there, that sometimes you got to let them fight like little kids before you step in and separate them. The Kurds were no angels. They didn't help us in World War II. Now, isn't this very contradictory to the image that you're trying to present today? I think you're here because you're such a respected, knowledgeable, experienced ambassador to clean up their mess, try to do damage control for what the President said and did with this whole atrocious situation.
First of all, the President's public comments are his attempt to explain his decisions to the American people. That's a political decision. I don't have any real comment on how he goes about doing that. That's something that's in the political realm that every president, every political leader, everyone who runs for office has to decide how you reach out. I will say that having been around other presidents, the comments that they make privately are often pretty blunt and very, very sharp towards certain issues. So I'm not too surprised by the president's making these comments.
But if anybody heard those comments, would they think that protecting the Kurds would be a priority for this person?
Again, it's what we do. As you said, the president made those comments. He also sent his vice president, his secretary of state, and his national security advisor, I think that's unique in our diplomatic history, out not to give away the store, but to essentially tell Turkey, by the end of the day we were there in Ankara, we needed a ceasefire or we would take further action. That was not giving away anything. That was taking a very strong diplomatic position, and that set the stage for the ceasefire that we got then and for the additional Russian ability to persuade the Turks not to go in the other areas. The result is we have quiet along that entire front today, and we're proud of that.
Well, but you've said that Turkey reneged on previous deals, and you don't think Turkey is a real trusted ally, and it's not a good deal that they've gotten with the Russians. So what makes you think they're going to live up to this deal? And it's not permanent. You also made that point.
It's pretty permanent. It's semi-permanent. It's as permanent as anything is in this diplomatic world. I would say that, and this gets into Turkish thought processes and decision-making, and Mr. Palmer follows this more closely than I. Turkey now knows, in a way it didn't know when it went in, even though we told them 1,000 times, that it would suffer very strong non-military consequences if it took that action, because we did take those very strong non-military actions, including actions that are underway in this body. That's a different situation, and thus Turkey is well aware that if it violates the agreement with us, or for that matter violates other agreements we have, that we will lower the boom on them with sanctions. The sanctions executive order is still in effect that we passed on, that we issued on the 14th of October, and we're ready to do this again if necessary. So I think that is a process of us learning what the Turks are capable of, going ahead despite our warnings, and them learning what we're capable of doing, that is living up to our warnings to hit them really hard if they take that action.
I think we should have known what the Turks were capable of. You can ask Armenia, ask Greece, ask Cyprus now. They're drilling in their territory. I'm surprised we didn't know what the Turks were capable of. One brief thing, too, though. Erdogan has said that if Europe describes his current military operation as occupation, he's going to release 3.6 million refugees into Europe. That doesn't sound like he's going to be providing some good space for them to live. He's going to send them into Europe. Is the U.S. ready to help with this refugee problem that they've partially created? I know that we are lowering our cap on the number of refugees to some ridiculous number, even from last year, I think from 30 to 18,000. Where's our responsibility there? Anybody?
Congresswoman, we've seen the statements from President Erdogan and others regarding the threat to open the floodgate for refugees, either encourage or somehow push people in the direction of Europe, but haven't seen any follow-up to that of any kind at this point. I would describe that position as rhetorical rather than an expression of Turkish policy.
We've provided $10 billion for Syrian refugees in Turkey and elsewhere, and that's the single largest contribution of any country, and we have every intention of continuing. We just took a decision for another $100+ million.
Thank you.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador, Mr. Palmer. Ambassador, you said earlier that we didn't consult with our closest allies when the President made that phone call with President Erdogan. That's correct?
I said we didn't tell them in advance of the decision. We consulted with our allies.
Oh, I'm just saying, they didn't know that phone call was going to happen.
That is correct.
Now, fair to say that was a mistake?
We often do not let our allies know in advance.
Fair to say it was a mistake, Ambassador?
No, it was...
It wasn't a mistake, then? Okay.
It was a mistake not to tell them before they learned about it from the media. That's always a mistake in diplomacy.
European, were there allies that had troops on the ground at that time?
That's exactly the point. They should not learn about that from the media, but
No,
from us.
I couldn't agree more. So you think that was a mistake?
I'm trying to get around enumerating the mistakes of my own
Why are you
bosses.
trying to get around that it's a mistake when it is? Why? We've heard this from so many witnesses. The best thing to do when you make a mistake is recognize it and own up. Now,
I've recognized it in one or another way 5 times today.
well,
I recognized it a 6th time.
It's a mistake. Fair to say it's a mistake. Can we do that at the end of the day?
Can I say it's a mistake? It was a mistake.
All right, thank you. Whew. Here's another concern I had. Even after that, did the President realize that was a mistake, not consulting?
You'd have to ask him, Congressman. The administration is
You're his envoy.
committed.
I just thought you might know. Here's my other question. I mean, you know, he said later on, and I've been to Europe. I've checked the path of foreign terrorist fighters, 5,000 or 6,000 that came from Europe. And what he said to Europe was, Europe, you know, you'll have to figure the situation out. And what you want to do with the captured ISIS fighters in their neighborhood. We're 7,000 miles away. We'll crush ISIS if they come anywhere near us. Now, you think that if they're in Europe, they're no threat to the U.S.?
The President thinks they're a threat to the United States. 2, he has done an extraordinary job defeating the ISIS caliphate. 3, he is justifiably extremely frustrated by European
Sorry,
relations.
Ambassador, it's so little time. Is it a mistake that he said that? Is that the way to treat our allies? They'll have to figure it out.
Our allies should start taking back their own citizens who have committed atrocious crimes as terrorists. That's the point he's trying to get across.
Now, we've been told, too, that through reports that we've been told by another ally, Iraq, that they don't want us to keep our troops there permanently. They want us out of there. Are you informed of that? They want us out. Iraq even wants us out.
We have a large number of U.S. and coalition forces in Iraq working with the Iraqis against ISIS. I have every certainty that we will be able to continue our forces there, as the guy who was the ambassador the last time.
So that statement, you don't agree with that statement that was reported that Iraqi officials have said, we don't want your troops here?
Some Iraqi officials say that every day. What they were referring to specifically was the additional troops that we were putting into Iraq. We had not yet explained to the government of Iraq, as it's our job to do because of the urgency of the situation, which troops would stay, what missions they were doing. Once we finish with that, I'm more confident that we'll get a good answer.
You weren't consulted with the President's phone call. You weren't on it. What did Secretary Pompeo say to you in terms of next steps? After that phone call, you're the envoy, he's the Secretary of State. What did he say in relation to that phone call afterwards? What did he tell you, going forward?
Sure. While maintaining the confidentiality of internal government deliberations, our going forward was get this offensive halted. Look at every means possible. Working with Congress on sanctions, our own sanctions with Treasury, diplomatic initiatives, presidential initiatives. The President took 2 separate initiatives, 3 counting sending Vice President Pence out.
Last question I had is this. I'm sorry. Can you sit there today and say that as a result of the President's phone call with President Erdogan, that did not affect in any way Erdogan's decision-making? Can you say that?
I believe that Erdogan had taken the decision. In fact, I pretty much know he had taken the decision before the call. What the President tried to do was to put on the table all other elements.
So the President, this is very enlightening, because evidently people were aware that even some of the comments of the President himself would indicate that that phone call had a significant, the President took credit for the fact he's bringing the troops back. So he thought that phone call had an effect on Erdogan's decision.
No.
The gentleman's time has expired, but the ambassador may answer the question.
Yeah, no. The purpose of the President's conversation with Erdogan was to try to dissuade him from something that in the days before we had suddenly decided was not a possibility, but a probability and then imminent. The president then deployed various diplomatic tools, incentives, sticks and carrots, if you will, in an effort to get Erdogan not to do that. He also made clear when Erdogan said he would do it anyway, we wouldn't support it in any way. We did not believe in this. We were against it. We wouldn't act militarily
Pretty
against it.
ineffective result. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I recognize the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. It's very clear that we're here for one reason and one reason only today. 3 weeks ago, President Trump held a phone call with the Turkish President, Recep Erdogan, during which, by his own admission, he gave Turkey the green light to invade Syria and endanger the Kurdish people. This one action set off a cascade of destabilizing events that have endangered U.S. national security, the stability of the Middle East and the world. Turkish troops have invaded northern Syria. More than 100,000 people are displaced, and hundreds of ISIS supporters have escaped. And Turkey and the Turkish-backed militia have been accused of atrocities against the Kurds, including the alleged use of chemical weapons. The Trump administration bragged about a ceasefire, though Turkey has said their operation is likely to continue. These actions are indefensible. I believe that, as in any conflict in the world, our response as a committee charged with overseeing this administration's foreign policy must be guided by our values: respect for human rights, self-determination, and human dignity for all involved. What is missing here in all the conversations about great power competition and about diplomatic norms and about sanctions is that the most important and fundamental function of what's happening. This is a question, in the end, of human rights and democracy. It's a question of whether Kurds have the right to exist as Kurds. We need to center the rights and dignity of human beings. We need to center the rights and dignity of the Kurdish people as Kurdish people. We have allowed this, and we need to talk about accountability. Accountability does not mean canceling and freezing bank accounts. It does not mean crippling the Turkish economy, enacting mass punishment on populations that didn't choose this. It means thinking seriously about justice for these atrocities. It means thinking seriously about how we stop arming and supporting brutal regimes in the name of our national interest. It means looking with clear eyes at foreign policy that threatens entire groups of people as expandable tools to be used and then discarded if we believe it serves our narrowly defined interest. It means not using the lives and suffering of human beings halfway around the world, suffering that we have permitted, that we have encouraged, as a card we play in our domestic political arguments. So, Ambassador, if it turns out that the Turkey or Turkish-backed forces have used chemical weapons on civilians, what responsibilities does that trigger for the United States?
Again, we have taken a position with the Assad regime on using chemical weapons. We are opposed to it. We made an announcement, Secretary Pompeo, at the UN General Assembly now about a month ago on the latest use of it, chlorine by the Assad forces near Idlib. We're looking into the one accusation that was made, the use of white phosphorus, which under some circumstances is a legitimate military ordinance. Under other circumstances, it is not. You have to look at the circumstances, and that's what we're doing now.
Yeah. When we had the hearing on Syria, I talked about how I felt Turkey and Russia were guiding our policy in Syria and how that was alarming to me. I just wanted to know whether you had an input from the letter the President sent to President Erdogan on October 9th.
I was involved in receiving the letter from General Mazloum the commander of the SDF, that the president then passed on to President Erdogan. And I was involved in the general. This is the problem of consultations. We consult with the secretary with the president all of the time on a variety of issues. This president and other presidents then take decisions based upon the sum of all of that, instincts, gut feelings, and everything else. It's how it works. And that produced that letter.
I'd wish that more of you had direct input onto that letter, because I think it's fair to say that the letter is humiliating to the United States. I know you won't be able to agree with that publicly, but it is. Both there is diplomacy, there's art to diplomacy, and quote, don't be a tough guy, don't be a fool. It's not art, it's a national embarrassment, and it's a disgrace. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the distinguished gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Palmer. Mr. Ambassador, you've agreed that the Turkish incursion into northeastern Syria is a disaster and has further compromised U.S. national security interests. Is that correct?
It was heading that way, that's for sure.
So we have 176,000 civilians so far displaced, hundreds killed, potential war crimes committed, U.S. and allied efforts to secure an enduring defeat of ISIS perhaps put in jeopardy, and prompted the SDF to align with ISIS and Assad and Russia to protect themselves from Turkey, and U.S. credibility damaged worldwide with our allies. Would that be a fair summary of the consequences?
Possibly a bit harsher than I would put it.
Well, let me ask you this. Was the President advised, therefore, not to withdraw U.S. troops, thus avoiding both the Turkish invasion from Turkey and the move from the south by SDF and Assad?
I'll try again on this one, Congressman. The President received a whole variety of advice on troop presence in Syria, troop presence in Afghanistan, and troop presence in certain other areas where internal conflicts make our presence less than obvious, such as in Europe and in South Korea. That's the job of any president. This one takes that particular issue very seriously, as they should. But that's separate from a decision on withdrawing troops and not withdrawing troops is separate from Erdogan's decision to go in. The Turkish incursion was a decision taken by the president of Turkey. It was not a decision he took because we told him he could, or that we wouldn't oppose him. He knew we wouldn't oppose him because we had never told him we would oppose him, nor this administration, nor the last one.
Mr. Ambassador, there is, however, a sequence. Mr. Erdogan, despite many, many threats, has not undertaken this kind of incursion until the President of the United States informed him that we were going to withdraw our troops and stop providing protection to the Kurdish fighters and Kurdish villages. Is that not correct?
It's totally incorrect.
Incorrect.
Incorrect. And I've done this for 2 days. I'll do it again. Those troops were not there to protect the Kurds from the Turks. It's
no,
that
that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, is there a connection, the rest of the world sees it, between our decision to withdraw and the Turkish decision to cross the border and begin engaging in what is euphemistically called kinetic activity, combat with our Kurdish allies?
Congressman, in looking at thousands of pieces of information and intelligence, I have seen no indication that that was a factor in the Turkish decision to come across.
Really?
Really.
So your contention, given your portfolio, is that the Turks were prepared to cross the border and engage in combat even if it required going through U.S. troops?
Please put your microphone on.
There were 2 outposts up there that did not have the mission of stopping the Turks or anything else other than observing fire on both sides.
Did they de facto have deterrent value?
Absolutely not. In
So
fact,
why didn't the Turks go in sooner? How is it just coincidentally the Turks decided to go in only after the conversation between our president and President Erdogan of Turkey?
right, but the president, this is the conversation that the president had with Erdogan. Again, I was briefed on how it went down, but not the specifics. But my understanding is, and I think it's accurate, the president only said after he could not persuade Erdogan not to come in, that obviously our troops would be out of the way because like any other president in a situation like that, correctly and importantly, he does have to think about the safety of our troops.
So is it your contention that where we have troops in other hotspots, for example, troops in Korea, South Korea, the president ought to be prepared to withdraw those in the event Kim Jong-un threatens an invasion of the South? Or, for that matter, Putin decides he wants to risk triggering Article 5 of NATO, and he wants to introduce troops where we have troops in NATO allied countries. Your position is they're not there for that value, and they could and should be withdrawn to avoid harm's way.
No, I've been unfairly emotional in answering what is a very understandable question. But however curious it may appear, there's a fundamental difference that we don't make clear as a country, let alone an administration, between putting troops under treaty obligations to defend territory and people against somebody else and the troops that we had in northeast Syria fighting ISIS.
Mr. Ambassador, there is, I agree, a difference between a treaty and not having a treaty. But there's also a matter of national honor and the word of a great country. We have fought side by side with our Kurdish allies who were successful. In fact, the only allied group in Syria that was successful in destroying ISIS and its caliphate. And the abandonment of the Kurds is one of the most shameful things I've seen in over 40 years of association with American foreign policy. And you're an honorable man, but you are defending something that lacks honor. And I feel bad for you. I feel bad for your career because that's no way to end an honorable career, defending the indefensible.
I insist on a response to this.
Yes, sir. And the gentleman's time has expired, but the ambassador
It's
may
only
respond.
fair to allow the ambassador
Yeah, of course.
to respond.
All right. First of all, I know of no responsible American official who has the authority to make such commitments, including Ash Carter, went on the record on Sunday, as did Tony Thomas, whoever told our SDF allies that we would use military force to protect them against Turkey. In fact, knowing that the Turks had a major and understandable problem with the PKK links of the SDF, we, again, very often made the point that there had to be a political reconciliation of one sort or another, and we committed to try to do that, which we did do. In fact, they did that. Members of the SDF, or the parent organization of the SDF, had been in Turkey up to 2015. We also where we committed was that we would do everything short of military force to try to hold off a Turkish incursion or Turkish military action against them. That includes the sanctions that we warned the Turks about. That includes diplomatic action. That includes a ceasefire we negotiated. But nobody in a position of authority that I know of, and whoever it is, this committee should call forth and have him or her explain on what basis he or she did that, ever told the Kurds that we would protect them militarily against Turkey. And it's not just by assumption that they made that, because we were very explicit, at least I was, for the last 14 months, saying we wouldn't do that.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I know my time has expired, and I'm the last questioner, apparently, besides yourself. May I just ask one follow-up question to that? And is it your testimony that it's your understanding the President of the United States told President Erdogan, therefore don't do it, even though we're not going to fight?
It is my understanding that he told Erdogan not to do it, and certainly all the rest of us did, and it is my understanding that the President made that clear as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Conley. I now recognize myself. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. I share the sentiment of all of my colleagues on this committee that this decision was, by the president, was immoral, reckless, and undermined the American leadership in the world, and most significantly, made us less safe. So I want to start, Ambassador Jeffrey. You are the special representative for Syria engagement and the special envoy to the global coalition to defeat ISIS. The reason we create special envoys is because we want someone who has special expertise, a lot of knowledge about a particularly complicated issue, and that be a resource in informing policy in that region, correct?
Exactly.
And you're telling us that you were not aware of the decision of the president prior to his making it to withdraw American troops from Syria.
I was aware that the president...
Well, let me rephrase it. You were not consulted by the president to get your best thinking on this.
I was consulted by the president through Secretary Pompeo literally dozens of times in the weeks and months before.
But by the decision that was made by the president after speaking with President Erdogan, before that decision was executed, were you consulted?
Very, very frequently by, again...
About American troop withdrawals from Syria?
All of the time by Secretary Pompeo and people in the White House.
And I presume you argued against it.
I can't indicate internal U.S. government deliberations, but I'm generally in favor of keeping troops on the ground when it makes sense.
Okay. And you said, and in this case it made sense, I take it.
That would be getting into...
Okay. You say in your written testimony that President Erdogan had a conversation with President Trump on the phone, and you say that in that call he indicated that the Turkey intended to move forward with this long-planned operation into Syria. Now, we've had American troops in this place for 5 years. And the only thing that changed in those 5 years that caused Turkey to actually execute this was the withdrawal of American troops.
That's wrong.
Well, what else changed?
No,
So for 5 years, President Erdogan has clamored that he wanted to do this, but he didn't do it. And he didn't do it in part, you would agree, because of the presence of American troops. Is that fair to say?
No, absolutely not.
Well, let me ask you specifically about the phone call then. Sure. In that phone call, he was told clearly by the president, this is your testimony, Ambassador, that U.S. armed forces would not support or be involved. Well, good thing. I mean, that's a really strong statement. We actually won't help you kill our allies who helped us defeat ISIS. That's a strong statement for the president. And then he said, and the U.S. will not endorse those actions. I should hope not. But you never say that the United States would oppose it and would, in fact, do everything we can to prevent it from happening. And you said just now, our troops would be out of the way. So you're saying that when President Erdogan said we're going forward, President Trump said, well, I can't endorse it, we're not going to help you, but we'll get our troops out of the way. Is that your testimony?
The president said all of that, but I think the context is incorrect. He wasn't saying our troops who are protecting the Kurds from you will get out of the way. The president said, we've got too little, I think he meant the too little detachment up there. They'll be out of the way, so don't do anything bad to them.
So in that conversation where the president said, we won't endorse it, we won't support your actions, and our troops will get out of the way. It was after that phone call and those representations were made that Turkey began its invasion and the slaughter of the Kurds.
Turkey had taken its decision before the phone call.
It's after that conversation that they executed that. I know you said they made a decision, but they executed it, correct?
That's true.
Okay. And it's been reported that yesterday Russia and Turkey agreed to a plan to push Kurdish fighters from a wide swath of territory just south of Turkey's border, cementing Vladimir Putin's preeminent role in Syria as U.S. troops depart and American influence wanes. You agree with that assessment? Fair assessment?
Not completely.
Well, it clearly leaves Turkey and Russia in control of territory formerly held by Kurdish fighters.
That is true.
Okay. And it certainly cements Vladimir Putin's very significant role in Syria now, correct?
Putin has long played a very prominent role in Syria, and he sees this as playing an even more prominent role.
Well, you do as well as an expert in the region, don't you?
I'm very troubled by this agreement.
Okay. Because it increases the role of Turkey I'm sorry, the role of Turkey and Russia both in this region, correct?
Oh, there are many reasons to be troubled.
But that's two of them at least, right?
Probably.
Okay. You also said that you thought we could continue our relationship with SDF. I hope that's true, although it's hard to imagine that they would have much confidence that they can rely on the United States in light of our conduct and the notion that because there wasn't an explicit promise. You know, sometimes in international affairs, as you know better than anyone in this room, when you have people who have acted on your behalf in your interest at considerable sacrifice, more than 10,000 fighters, really, really skilled fighters from the Kurdish people that have helped us defeat ISIS, that doesn't require a written contract, that there would be an expectation that we would acknowledge that if we expect people to act in American interests in the future. So I hope that they'll continue to work with us, although I can certainly understand it if they decided not to. Mr. Ambassador Jeffrey, you're familiar with this Syria study group report and recommendations, correct? We had a hearing last week with two co-chairs of that group, and they gave us detailed readouts of how the president's decision will impact our ability to succeed in Syria, and they painted a picture that was not very bright. So I want to talk about some of the assessments that were contained in that report and get your feedback on them. One of their assessments was that the liberation of ISIS-held territory does not eliminate the group's threat to the United States. And do you believe that the decision to withdraw has made it easier or harder to contain ISIS inside of Syria?
Well, again, the president this morning has said that he's not withdrawing all of the troops. Generally speaking, withdrawing troops from a situation, be it Iraq in 2011, be it Syria in 2019, does not enhance our ability to deal with internal threats.
But it's complicated by the fact that the president also said it's Russia and Turkey's problem to contain ISIS, didn't he?
I believe at one point he may have said that.
Well, that's not, is that the policy of the administration?
We have an agreement with the Turks as part of the ceasefire agreement to work with us in containing ISIS, and the Turks actually in the area around Al-Bab and Trablus did that quite successfully in 2016. The Russians at times have been successful against ISIS in Palmyra, for example, so it's at least theoretically possible.
Ambassador Jeffrey, you said you were not on the telephone call between the President Erdogan and President Trump. You've testified a lot about the call. Have you seen a readout of the call?
I've been briefed extensively on the call.
By whom?
By members of the administration who were on the call.
Have you seen a transcript of the call?
I have not.
You were then made reference to a letter that was subsequently sent 3 days later, or presidential message. Did you deliver that message?
I delivered a message that the president had cleared to the Turkish leadership, to President Erdogan, that if they did not accept a ceasefire, that we were trying to negotiate very quickly. We had good information that the SDF would turn to the Russians and the Syrians, so that therefore they could get a ceasefire with us and minimize the damage, or they would wind up being faced with more Russian and Syrian government involvement in their area, which is exactly what happened. They didn't listen to us, and they now have a more difficult situation from the Turkish standpoint.
And Ambassador, did you participate in the preparation of that, I don't even know how to describe it, the letter the president wrote that the only thing that was missing is maybe it should have been written in crayon? Did you participate in the drafting of that letter to President Erdogan from President Trump about don't be a tough guy, don't be a fool?
We provided input to that informed, as we would put it diplomatically, the president's decision. I would just note that in the wake of that letter, while President Erdogan referred to it publicly in a rather dismissive way, I'll throw it in the wastebasket, he then spent 5 hours with President Trump's emissary, negotiated an agreement, and had a very positive call with President Trump the next day, which I was on. So whatever we say about the letter turned out to be a pretty effective tool of diplomacy.
Yeah, Ambassador Jeffrey, I'll just end with this. I hope that you hear from this committee a bipartisan sense of disgust at the policy of the president, that it has harmed our standing in the world, it has betrayed an important ally to the United States, which undermines our ability and our leadership around the world. It has created a greater opportunity for ISIS to reconstitute and pose a real threat to the United States. And although all of this can be attributed to the Turkish invasion, you will not convince me, and I think many members of this committee, that that was precipitated by the President's conversation with Erdogan and not being forceful enough about keeping U.S. troops in that region. And as a consequence of that, that's what changed. 5 years had passed. Erdogan had threatened that, but had never done it. But when the President said, we'll get out of your way, I can't condone it, it was an invitation to do it, and that undermined the national security interests of this country. It was a dumb idea for the President to do it. It has wrought chaos to the region and undermined the interests of our country, and I hope you will take that back in as clearly terms as you can as the administration and Congress tries to figure out how do we mitigate the damage that this horrific decision has wrought upon us and the world. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.